What's up, Christ-Centered Mental Health Community? This is me, David Lydia Sarchet, and I represent Christ-Centered Mental Health, the ministry where I talk about mental health awareness from a Christian perspective in order to give you real hope in Jesus' name to the glory of God the Father by the power of the Holy Spirit. And before I get started on this interview, I just have a couple announcements for those of you that are new to this channel. You can support this ministry through prayer, and you can also support this ministry through Patreon. And also, please check out the On Faith and Mental Illness blog that I just started. You can check that out. The links to these will be in the description box below. So today's episode of His Strength and Weakness is actually a special edition because it's also going to be combined with Behind the Brain, because my guest here, not only does he struggle with a mental disorder, but he also is a mental health professional as well. His name is Joel. Joel, how do you say your last name?
Furches.
Furches. Okay. Can you introduce yourself? Like, tell us what exactly is your mental disorder? What are your credentials to start off with?
Sure. Well, since you asked the mental disorder first, I'll go with that first.
Okay.
In around 2007, I was working at a church youth group in North Carolina, and one night I have this very bizarre experience where it's like deja vu. It feels like I'm trying to remember something. There's this memory just trying to break through. I'm getting little brief glimpses and flashes of it, but I can't quite nail it down. I'm trying to grab this thing with my mind because I'm clearly some kind of memory's coming through, but I can't quite get it. And then it goes away. And it just like the whole experience was intense. And so that was strange. And it was even stranger when it started happening again. And in my mind, I'm having deja vu, and there's this thing that was really important that I was trying to remember, and I just couldn't get it. So one day during youth group, I was, doing my thing, and then I get this memory start coming through, and I was like, all right, I'm going to figure out what it is I'm trying to remember. So I isolate myself in a closet, and I start focusing on this memory and really trying to bring it out, and I start getting physically ill. Like, wow. I feel like I'm going to vomit. And I was like, well, I'm not doing that again. I'm just going to have to live with it. And for thereafter, this would happen to me sometimes. I would just get this sense like deja vu, except it would last maybe a minute or two, and then I would feel exhausted on the other end, like mentally exhausted. And it felt bizarre. It felt like the kind of thing I should talk to a doctor about, but it was very difficult to describe. And I knew doctors were just going to start putting me on a lot of medications. And I was like, yeah, I'd prefer to live with this than deal with side effects of medications. So yeah. Then one night, it was the middle of the night, I wake up and I'm looking, the lights are on in my room, and there are paramedics around my bed, and my wife is there, and my parents are there, which is very strange to have in the middle of the night. And I'm told that I had a full-out convulsive seizure. And I'm taken to the hospital. Oh my gosh. After that, I went to a neurologist, and they ran me through a couple of tests. They do this sort of flash test to see if they can trigger a seizure. And then they do this thing where they deprive you of sleep for a whole night and then put you on this thing and hook you up. And I passed all the tests. They said, you don't have epilepsy. And so I went to work that day, and at the time I was working in retail, so I'm helping a customer, and then I'm not helping the customer. I'm in the hospital, and I've had another seizure, and I flopped down in front of the customer and started flopping around on the floor, and they had called them paramedics. And I'm told after they took my, wiggling body out of the store, the customer is like, am I going to get some service here?
Oh, wow. See, people are so messed up. Like I had an experience like that one time. Like it was when I was in school. Like I remember I was doing some research on the computer, and the girl next to me just out of nowhere just flopped down onto the floor out of her seat and started seizing. And I didn't know. I didn't know what was going on at the time. I was like, what the heck? Like it was pretty frightening to me.
Yeah, well, I found out that those bouts of deja vu that I was having were actual seizures. They were what they call a partial simple seizure, which an isolated area of your brain starts shorting. That's essentially what a seizure is an area of your brain starts experiencing hyper electrical activity. And in this area of my brain, it was the memory area of my brain. So I was having this sensation of remembering something, but I wasn't actually remembering anything.
So it's like a false memory, kind of?
No, I'm sure from what little I know of how the brain works, I'm sure that the electrical activity was kind of stimulating areas of my memory center of the brain. And so it was just bringing together just kind of glimpses of little memories that I may or may not have had. Enough to give the impression that I was trying to remember something, but I wasn't.
Yeah.
Anyway, so at that point, they started putting me on medications like you do. And they would put me on a medication and the seizures would go away and I'd be fine. And then one day I'd have a breakthrough seizure. A breakthrough seizure means that the seizure breaks through the medication. And it's similar to like if you're an alcoholic, you can drink a certain amount and get drunk, but then it takes more to get you drunk and more to get you drunk. My brain kept adapting to the medications that I was taking to control the seizures, and then the seizures started happening again. And so after about 5 years of trying to control my seizures medically, they decided there's just no medication or combination of medications that's going to keep me seizure free forever. So they start doing scans of my brain and they find some tumors in an area of my brain.
Oh, no.
Now, the tumors, I'm told, were like a pinhead size and were not aggressive. They were benign tumors. They said this is the kind of tumor you would see in the brain of an infant as it's developing. So Lord only knows how long they had been there. But given that
were you not too concerned then with them, or?
Not concerned about them in the sense of they're going to grow and take over my brain.
Oh, okay. All right.
Concerned in they happen to be living in the same area of my brain that's seizing.
Oh, okay.
So it might just be coincidence, or there might be a connection between the fact that I have tumors in this area of my brain and I'm seizing in this area of my brain.
Yeah.
So ultimately the call was made, let's remove that area of your brain. Now that's a scary prospect.
I bet.
And so we looked into it, and the area of my brain that was being affected was on the right side of my body. I'm right-handed, and of course you know that means the left side of your brain is dominant.
Yeah.
And so they ran some tests, and one of the things they did was, truth serum, phentermine pentacol, I think. I don't know.
No, I never heard of that.
Truth serum? You haven't heard of that? Okay.
No, I never.
It's a type of drug.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of the word truth serum, but yeah.
It's called truth serum because they've used it it's a drug they've used in the past to try to kind of sedate people and get them to sort of drop their resistance to questioning and tell the truth. I don't know how accurate that is.
Is that what they give to like when you're in like the psychiatric ward and like they unruly patients to put them to sleep?
Sodium pentothal. That's what it is. I don't know. It's a drug. It has a lot of different applications.
Okay.
Anyway, they injected it into the right area of my brain where I'd be having removed, and then they ran me through some testing to see how well I'd be able to operate if that area of my brain was desensitized.
Okay.
And I did okay. One of the difficult things that I had was to associate facial expressions to emotions. Meaning that if that persisted after the area of the brain was removed, then I wouldn't be able to connect, say, you smiling to the sensation of you being happy. I couldn't read facial expressions. Either that or I would misread facial expressions. Would be the concern. Otherwise, I was doing fairly okay. And so in 2017, I had that area of my brain removed and went back to work. Now, that's a backstory of the sort of mental challenge that I have. Mine is a neurological challenge more than anything, because whatever mental disabilities or effects that I've had are a result of having an area of my brain removed.
Yeah.
So that answers that question. That's a very long answer to that question.
Yeah, that I actually I was gonna say, I thought it was interesting how you mentioned breakthrough seizures. It kind of reminds me of, because like with my schizophrenia, I even on medications, I can have breakthrough hallucinations,
Mm-hmm.
which is essentially where like I have hallucinations that break through the medication. So like I can identify with you on that level somewhat. Like
Yeah.
so what are your so like so the next question is, what are your credentials?
Sure. So I'm going to take a long time to answer this if it's okay.
Yeah, take as much as long as you want.
Sure. So I've always been a creative guy. I'm an
Okay.
artist, I'm an actor, and I'm not just saying
Oh,
that. I
nice.
actually signed with an agency and I've
Oh,
done
wow.
freelance art and so forth. So those are the things I really enjoy doing, and I'm a writer.
Okay. Oh,
Um,
nice.
yeah. So when I went to college, if I had been allowed to pick my degree path, I would have picked something in the creative fields. But my
Okay.
parents were wise enough to know that, you can't really get employment, steady employment in acting, art, or theater, or writing. So they pushed me in another direction. My best
Hmm.
friend in high school had been blind, and I had spent a lot of
Oh,
time in classrooms helping him with his work, um, because I was being a good friend, and that's what friends do, right? They help each other. So,
yeah.
and then um, I had carpooled with this kid, and he was much younger than me. I was a teenager at the time. He was in elementary school, and he was very, very autistic, nonverbal. He would have sort of emotional outbursts.
Hmm.
Um, he did self-injury behavior, that kind of thing. And I would sit next to him
Okay.
because I was on the same ride as him, and I was
Yeah.
able to kind of keep him under control. So I sort of had a calming influence on him, and his parents had not been able to leave the house since he was born because of the kind of person he was. So when they found that there's this teenager that they can actually trust around their son and who can keep him calm, they were happy to hire me as a babysitter for a considerable amount of money, a lot.
Hmm.
So I had a best friend who was blind. I helped him with work, and I was able to keep a severely autistic kid under control and form a relationship with him. And my parents were like, "Oh, special education. That's what he needs to do." And
Hmm.
there's no shortage of need for special educators in the market. So I
Yeah,
was
that's true.
guaranteed work. So I went to school for special education. Well,
Hmm.
as it happens, about my first semester in, the head of the special education department in that school um, left. He got cancer.
Oh,
So he
wow.
left. And so they stuck another person in the department who was not a special educator and didn't know what she was doing. And so they gradually just kind of shut down that department and phased it out. And she was a terrible advisor and gave me bad uh, advice, so that it gets to about my fourth semester and she's like, "Yeah, you're not going to be able to graduate with a degree in special education. You don't have the coursework and there's
Hmm.
no way you're going to get it. You're going to need to find something else to graduate in." So we looked at the coursework that I'd done so far, and the only thing I could get a degree in with the coursework I'd done would be psychology. So I graduated with a
Well,
degree in psychology. Now, I told you all that to say that I never wanted a degree in psychology. I would have liked to get
yeah.
a degree in something creative. I
Yeah.
didn't get the degree I was aiming for, which was special education. I graduated with a bachelor's in psychology, which is a worthless
Oh,
degree.
wow.
A
Yeah.
bachelor's in psychology will get you a job at McDonald's.
Yeah, you definitely, if you're going for psychology, it's better to get like a master's or a doctorate.
Yeah, or some kind of certification at the very least.
Yeah.
So, fortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, the mental health field has a high turnover and is desperate for people willing to do the jobs and fill positions.
Yeah.
So, my very first job out of college, I was able to get because they were desperate for people to work there. And that is at a group home with abused children. Now, this is
Mm.
challenging work because abused children have a great deal of baggage that they bring with them. And when you stick all of these abused children in the same room together, living in the same kind of residence, then they sort of compound each other's difficulties and uh, share their
Yeah.
difficulties.
You're giving me
Shit.
flashbacks right now.
And I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. No, like people know that like I have experience in group homes and the foster care system. So like I'm just like thinking about all these experiences I had with like other kids, like and like you're absolutely right. Like the relationship is very complex.
Yeah. And oftentimes children who have been abused especially
yeah,
will act out the kind of abuse they received on others,
yeah,
and
that's
usually
true.
other people weaker than themselves, which would be the other children. And
Yes.
so, we had this constant problem of children mistreating each other. They didn't know how to form relationships.
Hmm.
And so and I could tell you lots and lots of stories about that environment and different cases that came out of that environment. I don't want to
Yeah.
traumatize you further though. So
No, it's oh you no you. I was just joking about the flashbacks. What I meant was I was just remembering stuff from back then. Like you can go ahead and tell me stories.
well, I'll walk you through further of my background. All right. So after working there for about 5 years, um, I went into retail, which is
Okay.
about the time I started developing my seizures. And during my time in retail, I began working on a master's in special education, the thing I had been
Oh,
aiming to get in the entire time anyway. So
yeah.
eventually I got my master's in special education and then moved on to a disciplinary school. A disciplinary school, they're called alternative learning centers typically.
Hmm.
And alternative learning centers are, let's say you're a student in a school and you're misbehaving.
Yeah.
On the first instance of misbehavior, you might be sent to the principal's office. On the center, you might be given detention for that
Huh.
day. On the third, you might get expulsion. You'll be expelled from the school for a while and
Yeah.
then come back. But if this keeps going for a long time and it doesn't seem like any of the disciplinary acts that the school is taking can help, you may be sent to one of these alternative learning centers. And
Hmm.
the alternative learning center is a day school. You're not locked in there or anything. It's just the
Yeah.
place you go during the day to go to school.
Kind of
But
like
it
a
is
day program, sort of.
well, it's like a school.
Okay.
Only every student that goes there has severe behavior issues. And as a result,
Oh.
you're
Okay.
taking all of the worst behaved students in the county and sticking them in the same school together.
Is it kind of
Um,
like an alternative school?
yeah, an alternative learning center is what they're called.
Okay. Sorry, I was just trying to cause I never heard the word that you use. When I've heard of them, I've always heard people call them like alternative schools.
No,
Like,
yeah,
yeah.
alternative education. We would call it alt
Okay.
ed. But
Oh, okay. All right, that makes sense.
yeah, so the population that I work with there, they were misbehaving for any number of reasons. They
Okay.
didn't come in with diagnoses like they would at the group home.
Yeah.
Um, Actually, that's worth mentioning. When I was working at the group home, I was working in a diagnostic unit. And a
Hmm.
diagnostic unit is where you would send a child who just got pulled by social services and does not have a portfolio. So the entire
Yo.
purpose of the unit that I was working on was for them to go to an in-house school with a special educator who could then run them through tests and find out what their educational needs were. And then they would have therapists and psychiatrists and
Sorry.
all right, and counselors and doctors and so forth work with them to determine all of their needs. What are their mental needs? What are their medicational needs? What are their behavioral needs? Um,
Yeah.
so the children who were in this unit were there specifically so that we could figure out what their needs were in order to send them to a better placement for their needs.
Yeah. That
So
makes sense.
it was interesting to be the person who was getting to know the student before. I'm sorry, I keep saying student because mostly I've been an educator. They were
Yeah.
children. The
Yeah.
child before anybody else kind of got to. Anyway, so here I am in
Yeah.
this alternative learning center, having gotten my degree in special education, and this is the population I'm working with. The staff to student ratio was high, so your classes would have roughly about 6 people in them, or 6 students in them at any given time. Um,
Hmm.
Between 6 and 12, I would say, would be a class size,
Okay.
and then you would have typically more than one educator in the room at a time. I was a co-teacher because as a special educator, I'm not a subject specialist. I'm there to,
Okay.
to offer services to students who have qualified for them. services being anything from sitting down and reading the material to them to pulling them to a separate environment where they can have a little more focus,
Yeah.
to all, changing the assignments a little bit to fit their needs, things like that.
Oh,
So I
okay.
worked there for 3 years. And after leaving there, the next place I went was Board of Childcare, which is actually a Protestant organization. Is it
Oh,
Protestant?
nice.
Methodist, I believe.
Methodist. Okay.
Yeah, but they're run by the Methodist Council of Churches or whatever, but they're not
Yeah.
a strictly religious environment.
Yeah.
They have nods to religion, but generally they're a specialized kind of school. At least I worked in the school. They actually have residential units as well.
Oh, wow.
But I worked at the school center, and so the students would come there, and they would be what they'd call at-risk students. So that would mean that typically they would have some form of ED, which is emotional disorder, or they would have
conduct disorder.
Yeah, conduct disorder. They would have. I had several students who had autism. They were high functioning autistics, so you'd really have to keep an eye on their behavior to realize that they were autistic.
Yeah.
But yeah, I worked there for a year, and in that location, they'd had the best staff to student ratio I'd ever seen. There was almost a 1-to-1 ratio of staff to kids in the room.
Oh, really?
Yeah. This was a middle school setting. Now, these were extreme behaviors, so they were licensed to put physical restraints on students. And there were separate rooms that students could be taken to. They had crews in the hallways, kind of on the walkies, waiting for emergency calls from classrooms to remove kids. And there were sort of removal rooms to go to calm down with the kid. Now, they weren't locking anybody in a room or anything. They were saying, hey, let's go in here. Let's sit together, talk, that kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of like just a de-stress.
Yeah, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But if a student needed to be physically restrained because they were a threat to themselves or others, then that you had to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So I worked there. Go ahead.
I was gonna say that I understand that. I think it's interesting how you said they had a 1-to-1, like almost a staff 1-to-1, one staff to one student ratio. Like I actually like that because when I was in the treatment center I was in, they had a staff ratio of 1-to-8, and that was like that really caused a lot of problems.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's difficult to find staff who are willing to work in a place like that. So, ideally, the place that I was working would easily have allowed a 1-to-1 ratio, have every student have a staff member for that student, but getting people to get employed and then staying in that environment is difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. So I can imagine that there's a lot of I can imagine in that kind of field there's probably a high turnover rate because maybe people get burnt out or
I've seen people leave because they were physically injured on the job.
Oh wow.
Because you'll have a 12-year-old kid who weighs more and is more muscular than a 30-year-old adult. Sometimes. And especially if they've come out of an abusive environment. For instance, sexual abuse can cause the body to mature early. So you could have some child as young as, say, 8 who starts to develop, have hormones released for adolescent development, so that they gain kind of the muscle mass. And
that's interesting. I never knew that. Sexual. If you've been in sexual molestation can lead to early going through puberty early.
Yeah, and that could take a number of different courses. If a child were to be molested on a one-time basis, that may not have that kind of effect.
Yeah, it has to be consistent.
Systemic, regular abuse will cause the body to prematurely trigger those sexual hormones.
Wow.
And and that could be anything up to and including a regular exposure to pornography for the child. this child is being exposed to pornography on a regular basis, and their body
Yeah.
starts to respond to the pornographic material and, overdevelop.
Wow. That
So,
actually that makes a lot of sense now, because like I know I knew like I have seen that like in like the group homes and treatment centers and stuff that I've been in. I have seen like there'll be guys there that are like guys or girls there that are like 11 years old or 13 years old that look like they're like 18, 19 years old.
yep.
And I always wondered why that was the case. I never it never like I was like, that's so weird. Like I never understood why that happened like that.
It's
Like,
weird and it's unfortunate because it's kind of robbing them of their childhood to a degree.
yeah, exactly.
This
It's quite
acceleration into adolescence before time.
yeah. So the next question is, um, what's your experience with medication?
So I have some fairly advanced attention deficit disorder, and I've had that since forever. That's kind of a thing you're born with, more or less.
Yeah.
So they put me on Ritalin, I guess was the medication when I was a
Oh,
kid, and I tried very hard not to get on Ritalin. I have sort of always had this aversion to the idea of being on medication, especially something
yeah.
that's going to affect my brain, because for me, my
Yeah.
brain was always the most important thing about me.
Hmm.
And so I requested to try to, focus and learn and operate in a school environment without the medication. So
Yeah.
eventually I did manage to get off of it, but occasionally I would have to take it for if I was testing or something like that. Um, and then until I began to develop the seizures, I was more or less not on any kind of medication.
Hmm.
After the seizures started, I was run through a battery of medications. They would put me on a medication. It would control the seizures for 3 months, 3 or 4 months, and then I'd start having seizures again. Now, I
Oh,
don't want you to think that when I say I'm having seizures, I'm falling on the floor and flopping around. That may have happened 6 times in my life.
yeah.
Um, but that happened. Most of my seizures were either the partial simple seizures, which is the
Okay.
sort of strange sensation that overcomes you, or they were, I can't remember the other term for it. The typical term in kind of pop culture is absence seizures. Basically,
Okay.
you just kind of get kind of starey and lose focus and, click your finger
So
at the person in there.
is it safe to say that like okay, so if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is like seizure disorder is kind of like on a spectrum, sort of.
Yeah, it is
Okay.
definitely on a spectrum, and it's interesting. It's a very interesting subject matter because it depends on the area of the brain that you're having the seizures.
Okay.
So I was having the seizures in the memory area of my brain, which is why I was having this sensation of trying to remember something. If
Hmm.
somebody is having a seizure in, um, say, the amygdala, you know the what part I'm saying. Amygdala.
Amygdala, or
Yeah, it's the area of the brain that affects emotions.
yeah, yeah, I know what you're talking
Then
about. Yeah.
you can have a person who's having these unexplainable fits of rage
Hmm.
where they're just like suddenly out of nowhere tearing into people or tearing things apart, just, expressing this extreme rage, and
Yeah.
then it goes away and it's unexplainable. It's because that area of the brain is what's malfunctioning. There's
Wow.
extreme electrical activity in that area of the brain and is causing it. If it's happening in an area, in a sensory area of the brain, it could cause hallucinations. It could
Hmm.
cause any kind of hallucination, auditory hallucinations. They say the worst is
Wow.
the olfactory hallucinations, where you start to smell things that aren't there. And frequently,
That's
people who have
interesting.
you've heard of people having auras before seizures, right?
Auras? No,
Okay,
I've
so
never.
aura is just sort of this sensation you start to develop that is kind of a warning that you're about to have a seizure. And
Hmm.
sometimes an aura can be an olfactory aura where you start to smell kind of a metallic um, smell in the back of your not sinuses. And
That is quite interesting because I know, like, with my schizophrenia, like one of the kind of like the hallucinations I have is I can smell things that I normally shouldn't be able to smell. Like I remember I there's times where I can like literally smell TV shows.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah,
interesting.
and that is a crossover in the sensory area of your brain. So,
Hmm.
oh shoot, I lost the name of it. There's a disorder where you're able to, see sounds, smell colors, that kind of thing. And basically, that's just
Yeah.
because you've got an area of your brain that has sensory organs in it. It processes sight, smell, sound, and so forth, and you get a
That's
crossover. And so it's not real. It's like a distraction at best, but
yeah, it
it's not
is.
supposed
It
to be
is a
good.
distraction. Like it really is. Like I remember when I was younger though, I used to like I didn't know what was going on when I was younger, obviously, but I remember
Mhm.
like I used to determine whether or not I wanted to watch a show based on if I liked the smell of the show or not. Like
Yeah. And that's, that's a crossover in the sensory area of your brain. The sensory of your brain
yeah.
is lighting up when you're watching the show. And so you're receiving some kind of sensation that's not actually there. If you want to hear
Wow.
about the coolest version of this I've ever heard, there was this guy in England. This would have been maybe
Okay.
10 years ago. And this guy is leaving a karaoke pub and he gets knocked over and starts getting kicked around by some guys. He's being jumped. I don't know if they stole anything from him or what, but due to the nature of his injuries, he developed a brain damage. So essentially,
Okay.
what I've got. Now, you wouldn't
Yeah.
think that a brain damage would rewire your brain, but you'd be wrong because when an area of your brain is damaged, your brain has to rewire around that area in order for you to continue to function as a human being.
Yeah.
So other
Yeah.
parts of your brain have to start taking over functions that they didn't do before. And the
Yeah.
result of this for this guy was he started to see the world in terms of mathematics, specifically
What?
geometry. Everywhere he looks, he's seeing sort of the lines drawn for the curves and the planes and the angles of the world around him.
That's
So
like a
suddenly,
beautiful mind right there.
yeah, suddenly
Yeah.
he's starting to literally see in his visual center mathematics. And it's because his
Wow.
brain, parts of his brain were taking over functions they weren't used to doing. And so he would
That's
start to sketch this stuff out. And, geometricians and mathematicians were looking at these sketches he's making of how he's seeing the world. And they were kind of amazed at the amount of mathematical insight that was going into these sketches he was doing.
Was he a mathematician before this
He
happened?
was a furniture salesman.
Wow.
His
Oh wow.
grades, his grades in school were less than exceptional,
Oh my gosh.
average at best.
Do you have an art? Do you have a link to this? Like, I would like to read this story. Like, that's
I'll have to send that
fascinating.
to you later, but yeah, I can
Okay.
provide you with that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But yeah,
Wow.
I mean that's just an example of what I mean when I say areas of your brain can cross over and
Yeah.
cause these kind of things. And I mean schizophrenia is a lot about hallucination, but it's not just visual
Yeah.
hallucinations, it's auditory hallucinations and olfactory
Yeah.
hallucinations,
Exactly.
which
Yeah.
is what you're describing, smelling things that aren't there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
to
I have like auditory and visual hallucinations too. But like, yeah.
Yeah. To circle that around to the question of medication, which we were talking about, one of the
Yeah.
seizure medications I was put on was it had a really bizarre effect on me. I mean, it had a bizarre effect in general. It just kind of felt bizarre.
Okay.
But one of the bizarre things about it was I would be sitting down to watch television, right?
Yeah.
And I'm watching television and I'm hyper aware of the fact that every person that I'm seeing on the television show is an actor on a set reading lines and playing a part. Like,
Hmm.
I'm not able to get into the fiction of it at all. To me,
Wow.
it's a bunch of people walking around, in front of a camera talking to each other, which is what it
Like
is,
your
but
perception. It seems like your perception was heightened.
something. I don't know. I wasn't
Yeah.
able, they call it a suspension of disbelief. You're able
Yeah.
to get into the fact that this is a performance and, invest yourself in the fictional
Wow.
aspect of it. I wasn't able to invest myself in the fictional aspect of it. I
Wow.
could I could no longer enjoy television because to me it wasn't fiction. It was, fact.
Yeah, and that was the side effect of the medication?
The best I can tell you. It started when I was taking the medication. It ended when I
Wow.
wasn't. So, and
Wow.
that's, I mean, that gives kind of an insight into how certain types of autism can feel.
Yeah.
Because with autism, there's sort of this hyper literal way of viewing the world around you. And so
Mhm.
you can't kind of get jokes. You can't. I work with an autistic man. This is some of the work that I do. and I do in-home care for him. And he still watches The Wiggles. He's almost 30, but most of what he does is sit around and watch children's programming.
Yeah.
One thing he doesn't watch, however, is animation. He can't get into animation because to him, those are just moving pictures. There's no human beings or literal things on the screen, and he can't look at those pictures and interpret them as, funny animals or human beings.
Yeah.
Or they're just celluloid images.
So he has to see like live people then.
Yes, which is why he watches Wiggles and not Looney Tunes.
Yeah. That makes sense. That's interesting. Like, it definitely is. I definitely would like to I don't know, I don't know how well like a person with autism would be able to come on here. Like, I would like to interview someone with autism, but I don't know like if they would be able to do an interview like this. But
well, I could try and set you up with somebody.
Okay, that'd be interesting. I would like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. Just remind me after the show. I'll get you the links to the articles I've been talking about, and I'll hook you up with somebody I know who'd be interested in coming on.
All right, cool. Thanks.
That's autism. No problem.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, go ahead.
Oh, what were you gonna say?
I was, walking through my medication history. I was on a medication called Vimpat for a long time. And with Vimpat, if I took too much of it, or, even the prescribed amount, it would feel like it would look like the walls were melting around me. Like if I could look at anything, like I could see it just kind of melting in front of me. And it's not unlike if you spin around really hard for a while and then you stop, you can still see the world moving, right? So it was similar to that. It was kind of a visual hallucination of the world moving, except instead of back and forth the way it would when you're dizzy, it was kind of up and down.
Wow.
But I would still lose balance occasionally for that.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Like, I've had friends who's also have schizophrenia who have told me that they've like seen like portals that would appear, like they would describe it as like portals to hell that would appear in their room, and like I never experienced anything like that. Like but I can just imagine how frightening that would be.
Yeah, the first time it happened, I ended up in the hospital because I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah, that would be.
Then I was told, yep, it's just your medication.
Wow.
So after I had the surgery, I started to experience a number of emotional and physical effects, which we ascribed to the fact that I was missing part of my brain, because one would assume having part of your brain removed would affect you.
Yeah, exactly.
But then looking on at the side effects of the medication I was taking, and I didn't do this until years later, it looked as if a lot of the emotional and sort of experiences that I was having were all listed in the side effects of the medication.
Yeah.
So that's a difficult thing to disentangle, because yes, having I'm doing PhD work towards a degree in psychology right now, general psychology, PhD. And one of the coursework that I did, or some of the coursework that I did, was on brain damage. TBI is the technical term for it, traumatic brain injury. They don't use brain damage because that can be used as sort of a derogatory at times.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah.
So TBI is what I'm diagnosed with. And so in taking that course and seeing all of the different things that come with TBI, I do what, and I'm sure you've done this before when you're reading about your subject area. You'll be like, yep, that's me. Yep, I got that. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. It's I call it hyperdiagnosis. It's the same thing you do with a horoscope. You read your horoscope and be like, oh, this is totally me. And it's totally you because you're reading yourself into it.
Yeah. You definitely got to be careful with like self-diagnosing.
Yeah. And so, I got the same kind of thing when I was reading about TBI and doing the coursework in it. And I wasn't sure how much of this was. The other difficulty that I had is that shortly after getting the brain surgery, later that same year, I lost my job. And, this was full-time employment, and I went down to being unemployed, and then I had to go through the job search and things got difficult, and I started having sort of severe emotional and mental and difficulties. And my wife was sort of ascribing all of those to the brain surgery when I was fairly convinced it was the fact that I was unemployed and was having difficulty finding employment. And so you had this weird mix at that time in my life where I had part of my brain removed, I was on medications with side effects, and I was also unemployed, which has associated, you'd be surprised possibly how badly unemployment can affect a person mentally and emotionally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's not a disorder, it's a circumstance in your life, but it really has an impact on you.
On your mental health. Yeah, that's true.
So I was having all of those things happening at the same time. It was not nice.
Yeah, I can bet. So are you on any medications now, or are you not?
Yes. So as a person who had a seizure disorder, I will have to take seizure medication the remainder of my life. And the reason for that is this: when you've heard this idea that if you behave in a certain way for long enough, it starts to form mental paths.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? And so kind of your behavior affects your neurology to a degree. Okay, so the same thing is true with seizures. Seizure is an intense activity in part of your brain, and that activity, if it happens intensely and frequently, can start to form neural pathways. And so when they slice that malfunctioning area out of your brain, they can't ever be certain that they've gotten all of the neural pathways that it's formed. And as a result, once the brain surgery is over, there's the possibility that these neural pathways that have been caused by the seizure activity might be triggered by something and start causing some kind of seizure activity again. So you have to take that seizure medication as a precaution for the remainder of your life.
Just in case. Yeah. That makes sense.
So unfortunately,
are you experiencing any side effects now with the medication you're on now, or are there no side effects?
I recently switched off of one of the medications, and I noticed that a lot of the things that I was experiencing, I wasn't as intensely, which made me believe that it was possibly the medication that was causing some of these. Again, it's difficult for me to disambiguate the things that I'm experiencing, how many of those are related to the seizure disorder. And how many are related to this brain surgery and how many are related to the medication. The only way to discover that would be to take me off the medication completely and see how I behave and how I feel. And there's danger associated with that.
Yeah, because then you run the risk of having another seizure.
And unfortunately, seizure medications are all about the same in terms of side effects. So it's never going to be clear to me how much of this is the brain damage and how much is the medication.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Dawn Gant, she says, what are your thoughts on brain rewiring? She says, focusing and disciplining your thoughts causes the brain to rewire. Dr. Caroline Leaf has done a lot of research and works on this for many years. This also affects the chemistry of the brain, focus, and attention.
So this is another area in which it's so difficult to define what comes first, the brain wiring or the behavior.
Yeah.
So my area of focus for a while was behaviorism, and this is associated with the special education, is that you can go through periods of behavior modification, and you modify behaviors by, kind of blocking one kind of behavior and rewarding another, and so your behavior starts to change as a result of that. But is that effect of, I'll give you an example. Let's say that my autistic man that I work with, let's say that he bites chunks out of his arm.
Yeah.
Now, you got to figure out, why is he doing that? It could be anything. It could be a number of things that are causing him to do that. Maybe he needs that feeling, that pain feeling. Something in his brain requires him to have that. Or maybe it's because he's trying to get attention. Maybe the fact that every time he does that, his parents are around him. He's going to the hospital and getting stitches.
So the kind of like positive reinforcement in that
right.
sense.
He's getting attention. Yeah. So yeah, any of those would be positive reinforcement. But
Yeah.
the point is, you figure out why he's doing that, and then you try to replace it with something else. So if he's doing it for attention, try to give him attention for something else, and stop giving him attention for that. Now, there's real ethical dilemmas when it comes to self-injuries behavior like that. If it's attention-seeking behavior and you ignore it, the person is going to just start hurting themselves badly.
Yeah.
So you really can't ignore that. So a different example, probably a better ethical example would be if some kid is acting out in school, and the whole classroom pays attention to that kid. Well, he's acting out for the attention. Stop giving attention to that behavior and start giving attention to him doing well. And he starts behaving in school to get that attention. Now, in doing that, you have started to rewire his brain by changing his behavior.
Okay.
Suddenly, the parts of his brain were acting up for the behavior because they were getting attention as a reward, start acting differently. Because now the reward is good behavior, is getting a grade and things like that. So the behavior affects the wiring, but then again, the wiring could affect the behavior. So
it's like it's kind of like a what came first, the chicken or the egg scenario, sort of.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, after
is there like amongst like psychologists, is there like a kind of like is there kind of like is there a consensus on that, or is it like a debate?
We know that external factors affect brain wiring, and we know that brain wiring affects behavior.
Okay.
So the problem is that you've got a lot of different fields of psychology, and each field focuses on a specific way of treating. Psychology is about two things. It's about describing behavior and treating behavior.
Yeah.
And so if your field involves a lot of sitting around and talking, then it's like the self-diagnosis thing you're talking about. I have not worked with schizophrenia, so I don't know the degree to which this is true of schizophrenia, but I can tell you that it's very true of things like autism and attention deficit disorder, that you start to read those behaviors into other people. You see another person doing a thing and you're like, I know why they're doing that thing. It's because they have autism, because this is a characteristic. So you start hyperdiagnosing not just yourself, but you start hyperdiagnosing other people.
I think that is, I think that is a tendency with people with schizophrenia. Because I know with me personally, like I do have a tendency, like if I see, like I said, I know what my signs are that I'm slipping into psychosis. And so if I see similar signs in other people, I do have a tendency to say, oh, that person might have this. But I try not to say that, because I know I'm not a mental health professional, so I can't diagnose. But I get what you're saying, that temptation is there.
Right. And so the point I'm getting in saying that is that if your field of study is, say, cognitive behavioral therapy, you're going to see the world through that lens. And so when you see, when you're asked a question about, hey, brain wiring and behavior, relation between them, you're going to say, well, here's the relation, and then you're going to give an explanation through your field of specialty, because that's the lens through which you see the world. And psychology being the kind of thing that you can't really sit down and weigh on scales, look at under a microscope, or observe through a spectrogram, makes it difficult to avoid seeing behavior through the eyes of whatever field you happen to be in.
Okay. So in other words, no one is truly neutral.
Yeah, it's very impossible to, that's, that's the point I'm working around to. One of the virtues of behaviorism, and you mentioned Skinner's the father of behaviorism. So that was his philosophy. And his philosophy was basically, look, we can't know what's going on inside the head and the mind and all of it. We can't even tell if the mind exists, much less, tell what's going on in it. So
Yeah.
all of this psychology, at his time, it would have been Freudian psychotherapy would have been the trend.
Yeah.
Is just speculation,
Hmm.
because you can't measure any of those things. The only thing you can measure are the things you can see. And
Yeah.
so in Skinnerian sort of behaviorism, it doesn't say that, the mind doesn't exist, or that, people don't have feelings or think thoughts. It says, look, let's stick with what we can observe. We can observe the environment around them and the immediate events before they do a thing. We can observe the thing they do, and then we can observe the consequence of the thing they do. And that's what behaviorism's focused around. It's the things we can see. And so in the end, if I say that every time a door slams, you cringe, I'm not saying, well, you cringe because you were frightened. I'm saying the door slams and you cringe. That's the antecedent and the behavior. And the consequences, you avoid, loud sounds. I don't know.
That's interesting.
None of that.
So finish what you're going to say. Sorry.
Yeah, that's just me recording what I'm seeing, and we can work with that. We can actually use that information to help you as a human being behave differently than you do.
Yeah, that's actually
reinforcing certain behaviors and not others.
That actually makes a lot of sense. Like I can definitely see your line, like how behaviorists like that their methodology actually makes a lot of sense. Like
yeah,
speaking about B.F. Skinner, have you heard of his book Walden 2?
Yes, I have.
I think that's actually quite a fascinating book.
Oh, you've actually read it?
Yeah.
I've never met anybody who's read that book.
Really?
And I've been in psychology for a while.
Oh, wow. I have the book.
I've just heard people say he's a terrible fiction writer.
Yeah, the book is kind of a dry read. But I thought it was quite interesting the way he paints this not really another world, but kind of this utopian society.
Right, exactly.
That's based off of behaviorism.
Principles of behaviorism, yeah.
Yeah, it was quite interesting.
So you were talking about neutrality. I think behaviorism probably is about as neutral as you can get.
Really?
As long as you're a methodological behaviorist and not a philosophical behaviorist. A philosophical behaviorist might go as far as to say that the mind doesn't exist, or that thoughts and feelings don't exist. That the only thing that exists is behaviors.
So what a methodological behaviorist say?
A methodological behaviorist would be like, okay, here's what we want. We want this guy to stop hearing voices that aren't there.
Wait, say that again? You kind of broke out.
I said, we want to get this guy to stop hearing voices that aren't there. All right. Wow. So how do we know he's hearing voices? He reports it. Okay.
Yeah.
So we can measure the frequency of him reporting hearing voices. What happens around him when he's hearing, immediately before hearing voices, or in the general vicinity when he is?
What triggers it? Yeah.
Right. What are the environmental features? Okay. And what happens, what's the consequence of him hearing voices? What are the things that happen immediately after he hears voices? And having those pieces of information, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence, the ABCs as they call them, we can try to manipulate those three factors in order to decrease the activity. That's methodological behaviorism. It's an intervention. It's trying to increase desirable behaviors and decrease undesirable behaviors through manipulating the antecedent, the consequence, or the behavior and the consequence. Okay. So methodological behaviorism says nothing about the reality of the mind, or feelings and thoughts and emotions and so forth, or even those voices. Now there's another field of thought that says, if a person is hearing voices and seeing things that aren't there and so forth, act toward them as if those things really do exist. And so treat it as if there really are people in the room saying things and doing things.
Wouldn't that feed the person's wouldn't that confirm the person's hallucinations though? Make them think, like make them believe that they are real, that they're not?
So the only people I've ever heard advocate for this particular form of treatment are
Yeah.
people who tend to be sort of on the woo side of things, sort of the spiritualists and the new agers and, somebody in
Oh,
that
okay,
area.
okay,
Now, people
okay.
who do advocate for it say that it's had very positive emotional effects on the person, that, the
Hmm.
person has, a much more, a much better emotional outlook once they're being treated as if people believe them and as if they're not living in a separate world, because the sort of
Hmm.
sympathy towards them and their environment is helpful. But I could see that to a degree because
Yeah.
one of the more unique therapies for the elderly, especially people who are experiencing senile dementia, is to put them in an environment that is closest to that which they grew up in.
So they'll be
So
comfortable.
you're
Yeah.
right. So you have them in a home where like the wallpaper is 1950s wallpaper, and the nurses and doctors are dressed in sort of the 1950s outfit, and they've got 1950s music playing on the radio, and maybe they'll play a baseball game on the radio for something. And
Okay.
as the person starts to enter this world which they're familiar with, the world that they still can remember in the parts of their brain that haven't deteriorated, they start behaving as if they're more lucid and more in touch with reality, uh,
Yeah.
because they're in an environment which the parts of the brain that still are in existence remember and can identify with.
Okay.
So,
That makes, yeah, I get that. I can understand that. Don Gant.
neuropsychology is weird
Yeah, yeah,
and
that
expansive.
yeah. Don Gant asks, how much do stress and anxiety affect mental illness?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, stress and anxiety are a trigger for mental illness.
Yeah.
And if you already have a mental illness, they can trigger that mental illness. So
That's
I
true.
am positive, without any doubt in my mind, I put all the money I own on this, David, that when you are in a period of increased stress for situational reasons like job, family,
Yeah.
something like that, that your episodes will increase.
Yeah, that's actually one of the first things my psychiatrist told me is that stress and high like stressful situations can trigger my delusions and hallucinations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And the same thing was true of my seizures when I was having
Yeah.
them. I remember one night I was driving home from work, and
Okay.
I had worked like a double shift, so it was a 12-hour shift, and I had forgotten to take my medication that morning.
Oh no.
And then, because I'm in retail, I had this person who like stayed in after the doors were closing because I was helping him at the time. I was
Hmm.
helping him, and closing time came around and he was still there, and he was yelling at me the whole time. He was just making me
Oh.
yell. And so I finally got rid of him. It was later than it should have been for me to leave. So I was under stress. I was
Yeah.
sleep deprived, and I was under medicated, and I had a seizure at the wheel on my way home.
Oh
Um,
man.
so yeah, stress was a trigger for seizures. And
Yeah.
related specifically to his question, now that I am missing a chunk of my brain, I notice that I have a threshold of stress that is much lower than it would have been before.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, I'm mentally exhausted and I can barely stay awake.
Yeah.
But if I go through an intense period of stress, say the students in my classroom are misbehaving, and then I'm left in the classroom alone with them, and they got up and start throwing, and I can't keep control of the situation,
Yeah.
that makes me hit my threshold a lot quicker. But that's also true of things like concentration. If I have to do some intensive academic work, say at home on a day off, um, I hit that threshold and I get exhausted much quicker. I have less
Yeah.
brain to deal with this. I have less brain than your average person, so my threshold is much lower than your average person.
Yeah. I can actually identify with that because well, I've gone a long time, like many years without medication, and as you probably know, the longer mental illness goes untreated, the worse it progresses. And So because my schizophrenia has progressed so much, now I have a low tolerance for stress too.
Hmm.
Like I get stressed out easily now, like when my computer doesn't do what I want it to do.
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
oh like and yeah, I kind of had an experience like a few years ago where I just got out of a relationship, and I
Hmm.
moved back to my home state of Colorado, and I was dealing with homelessness. I didn't have my medication at the time,
Hmm.
and I ended up going into like a manic episode where
Mm.
I thought that like it was biblically prophesied for me to assassinate Donald Trump.
Mm.
Yeah, I made a YouTube video saying that. It actually got the Secret Service's attention. They actually came down and visited me. Like,
Oof.
yeah, it was pretty bad. Like,
To get the medication you needed after that?
yeah, I did.
I
Yeah,
would hope so.
yeah. Well, the Secret Service said that I better make sure I stay on my medication from now on, because if they come down and visit me again, it's gonna be with handcuffs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it was pretty bad. It was a pretty scary experience too. Like, so, but
Yeah. At least it didn't go as badly as it could have, and so we can laugh about it now, right?
yeah, exactly. And obviously that YouTube video is no longer up. Like but,
Good call. Good
yeah,
call.
exactly. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's somewhere. I mean, once something's on the internet, it's never gone for good. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so when did you? Okay, so here's a lighter question.
Sure.
Well, when did you come to know the Lord, and how did you come to know the Lord?
So I am a person who has grown up in the church.
Okay.
Um, so I was raised in a Christian family. I was, my parents converted before I was born, and so I
Okay.
was in church from infancy onward. And as a person who raised in that environment, it's typical to not be able to identify, the moment that you were quote unquote born again or saved or whatever
Yeah.
it is. And frequently, I mean, there's this tendency, we talk about this idea of hyperdiagnosing or things like that. There's a tendency in the life of people who were raised in a Christian environment to try to isolate and identify that one moment that they were, quote, saved.
Yeah.
They'd be like, well, there was an altar call one time. I went up.
Hmm.
That's when I got saved. Or, well, I got baptized. I guess
Yeah.
that's when I got saved. I'm like that. I don't have a moment in mind that I could tell you that I was, you know,
Yeah.
born again or saved or anything like that. I'm a Christian by default.
Yeah.
Now,
I
that ties into my particular area of research, but we don't have to get into that.
I mean, we can if we want to.
All right. Well, I'll lay out my research as related to exactly what I'm saying right now.
Okay.
My area of research currently, what I'm working on my thesis for my PhD, is the area of religious deconversion, meaning going from being a religious person to being a irreligious person, somebody who's opposed to religion by, say, being an atheist or an agnostic or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, Anyway, the way that that relates is that I have yet to identify a person who has deconstructed, deconverted, whatever term you prefer, who has not been raised in a Christian environment. And
Hmm.
so these people who deconvert, or the popular term now is deconstruct, are people
Yeah.
who are raised in a Christian environment, and similar to myself, they don't have sort of an identifying moment that they became a Christian. And again, they'll all point to something like, well, yeah, I was convicted, altar call, my Sunday school teacher said we should say a prayer, something like that, because you
Yeah.
kind of have to, you're always asked, well, when did you get saved, kind of thing. And as a person
Yeah.
raised in the church, you kind of have to
Yeah.
come up with an answer to that question, right? So, but they're
Yeah.
Christians because of the environment they were raised in, not because they went through an intense conversion experience.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a commonality, a common feature of the background of these people who deconvert.
Hmm.
Not to
That
say that
actually.
I've deconverted or that I fear deconversion, but I come from that
Yeah.
same general
Yeah. No,
background.
I get what you're saying, and we kind of talked about a little bit about this like before the stream, I remember I told you that I actually have in like a really curious interest in like the world of atheism.
Mm-hmm.
Like It's definitely I've noticed that a lot of atheists, when they talk about their deconversion story, they tend to say that they came from like really strict legalistic backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's and that's just something I've noticed. Like when I listen to people like genetically modified skeptic and other people that talk about their deconversion story, they say, "Oh, like they came from like really strict fundamentalist backgrounds."
And the
Um,
reason for that is that the more strict the background is, the more expectations it sets for what you should expect your life to be like as a Christian.
yeah,
And so the more of those expectations that you have set in order, as those expectations fail to appear, especially as you start to mature into adulthood, you expect
yeah,
God to like have a plan for your life, or you expect that if you're on your knees praying every night that they'll get prayer answered, or some kind of expectation
yeah,
sets.
yeah,
Deconversion happens when your lived experiences do not meet your religious expectations. And
yeah,
so the more religious expectations are set, the more likely a person is to go through one of these dramatic deconversions.
yeah. I get that. Um, like I was gonna say about like your about how you said you can't really um pinpoint an exact day when you were saved. Like I relate to you on that because I can't pin like when I look back on my life story, I can't pinpoint an exact day when I was saved either. Like it was more like a process. Like because like I my mom I was raised by a Buddhist mother,
Okay.
and yeah, so I wasn't even raised in a Christian household, and
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, so I kind of think that that's salvation is kind of like a process. Would you agree with that?
So that's interesting that you asked that, because when I started my deconversion research, I also looked into conversion research.
Yeah.
Deconversion research really got kicked off around 2009, I would say, was when they started really looking into deconversion as a field of study.
Hmm.
Conversion research, the research of people becoming religious and adopting sort of religious ideas and practices, has been around for over 100 years now. So there's
Oh
a
wow.
lot more literature on conversion than there is on deconversion.
Okay.
Uh, so uh, I'm bringing this back to your question, um, which was, remind me again?
Is salvation being a process?
Process. Thank you. Okay. Yes.
Um,
So there are very specific conversion models which detail, the steps that a person goes through uh, between not being part of that religion and being part of that religion. And
hmm.
you can look at these models and you can see a stage by stage process being laid out. And basically, it plays out something like this. You enter a period in your life where you're experiencing some kind of difficulty. Um,
Hmm.
and difficulty is a very broad term. It could mean, a enormous stressor like a death of a family member, or going through some sort of mental illness or something like
Yeah.
that. But it could mean just kind of a general feeling of dissatisfaction with life. You can't quite put your finger on, or, you know, cognitive dissonance is what they would call it, when again, your expectations are not meeting
Doesn't
your lived
mean
experience.
reality. Yeah.
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 And so when you enter this period of discomfort because you've got certain expectations or needs that are not getting met, um, you go into what they call a seeker. It's not a seeker mode. You become a seeker, I guess, and that's the point at which you are open to the possibility that religion could address your problems. Now,
Hmm.
that doesn't mean that you're sitting there saying, "Hey, I know religion." It means that your mind is in a state where it would be open to the possibility of religion if somebody were to introduce it to you.
Hmm.
Okay. And
That's
so
quite.
at that point, you encounter the religion through either an encounter with an individual, perhaps some kind of written material, or the religious environment themselves. 99% of the time, it's going to be a religious individual. You meet up with somebody who represents that religion, and that individual represents the religion to you, because this is,
Yeah.
you don't know what being a Christian means until you've talked to this Christian. And now, in your mind, this is the only experience you've had with a Christian individual. This is what Christianity looks like.
Yeah.
So, if that's attractive to you at all, then you might start to experiment with the religion itself, read some material, attend an event, or something like that. And
Okay.
once you've actually interacted with that religious community, you gradually begin to become part of the community, and then you begin to identify as part of the community. And typically there's some kind of ritual that you would go through at the end of this process to confirm to the community that, hey, I'm one of you now. Maybe a baptism. And in Christianity, in Islam, there's a thing that you're supposed to say, a public proclamation of faith that you say. But it might even be just making an altar call or saying the sinner's prayer in Sunday school class.
Yeah.
Some kind of marker in your life that shows the community, hey, I'm part of you now. And that's typically what people would pinpoint as the moment of their salvation is, hey, I did this thing. I went through this ritual that made me part of the community. And that's when I got saved. But as as I'm suggesting by laying this process out, and as you said, it's an isolated moment.
Yeah. Can you repeat that? Because you kind of broke out for a second.
Sure. I said that you would identify this ritual that you went through to proclaim you're part of the community, like an altar call or a baptism or a sinner's prayer. You would say, well, that was the moment that I got saved. That's the moment I went from being, quote, unsaved to being saved, from being not a Christian to being a Christian. And this is how we've tended to think of salvation through most of church history. It's an isolated moment. It's what they call it crisis conversion, not because it's a crisis, but that's just the technical term for it. It's this idea that there's a moment, there's an event, a feeling, and bam, you're saved, kind of thing.
Yeah.
In psychology and sociology, they don't really see conversion as a crisis; they see it as a process, as you're suggesting. Now, psychologists and sociologists have a difficult time pinpointing when you're actually a Christian versus not Christian, or a member of the religious community, and they generally say that it's the moment at which you're able to give a testimony. And they call that your conversion narrative, because you are able to look back across your life prior to this moment here and say, okay, this is where God was leading me, this is the point he worked in my life, and this is how he brought me to salvation. So it's essentially you're rewriting your own life through the lens of a Christian.
So, to give a biblical example, say take someone like the Apostle Paul. So a psychologist would say that Paul's conversion started when he first started telling people that he was a Christian, or?
I love that you said that. Paul of Tarsus is given as the model of crisis conversion. You will not hear the definition of crisis conversion without seeing a reference to Paul, because there's nowhere in the Bible where there's that identifiable moment that a person went from being a really non-religious, in Paul's case, he was killing Christians, to being religious. He had the poster boy experience of a crisis conversion. He went from being very anti-Christian to being very Christian in an isolated incident. So they always talk about his as the model of crisis conversion.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I kind of the reason why I brought up Paul is because in a somewhat a way I kind of I kind of identify with Paul. I wasn't killing Christians, obviously, but actually, I was very anti. When I was younger, I was very anti-God, and I would take out my anger out on Christians.
Sure.
Because I thought I couldn't, because I knew I couldn't do anything to God, so I figured what's the next best thing to do is to take it out on his followers.
That's fair.
So, and actually, how you talked about what leads to conversion, usually religious figure comes to them. With me, it was the Mormons that came to me, and I started reading the Bible.
You were raised Buddhist, and then the Mormons came to you and introduced you to the Bible.
Yeah, and like I started reading the Bible because I wanted to try and disprove the Mormons.
Uh-huh.
Like, it's like yeah, like so it was quite like yeah, but yeah, like Anyways, so um, how has your faith in Jesus helped you deal with your mental disorder?
It's a really good question. So, I mean, when it comes to crises, when it comes to difficulties in life, there are, the Christian approach is typically something to the effect of, if I pray hard enough or I do XYZ, God will get me through this or he'll fix it,
Yeah.
you know. So that's one approach. Um, Another approach is something to the effect of, well, my faith in God is just going to support me as I get through this thing.
Hmm.
Um, my approach has always been somewhat like, look, I don't know what's coming out of this. Oh yeah, and that's another thing is oftentimes the idea will be like, okay, so um, this is happening to me so that something better can come out of it, right?
Hmm.
There's a reason or a purpose behind all of this.
Yeah.
Um, my approach has always been sort of a hyper skeptical approach, and what I mean by that is I don't know what's happening and I don't know why it's happening.
Hmm.
Um, but I do know that God doesn't owe me anything. And
Hmm.
so all of the good things that I do have are by His grace. You know, He didn't
Amen.
have.
Yeah.
And so I take this. Okay, so there's a parable told by Jesus in the Gospels, and He says, you'll be familiar with this. This vineyard owner goes out and hires some guys
Oh
to
yeah.
work the
Yeah.
vineyard, and then he goes out later in the day and hires some more guys, and he does this like 4 times.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, the last people who came into the vineyard to work had only been there for like an hour, so they'd only done an hour's work, and then the owner of the vineyard starts lining everybody up, and he lines the last people who worked up first, and he
Yeah.
pays them a full day wages. And so the people at the back of the line, they get excited, like, oh, wow, they're getting paid for a full day. Imagine what I'm going to get paid for. I've been here,
Yeah.
you know. And so they get up and it's their turn and they get a full day's wages and they start complaining to him. They're like, look, those guys didn't do any work and they got paid the same as we've been here all day. And then the
Hmm.
response of the vineyard owner is, look, it's my wealth. And you're complaining because I'm being generous with my wealth.
Yeah.
I get to control it. If I decide to be generous with it, that's my decision.
Yeah.
So that's on the one end of things. When you're experiencing benefits and blessings in life, everything you're experiencing is above what you are owed, which would
Hmm.
be nothing. And so
Yeah.
this is an instance of God being like the vineyard owner and being generous with his wealth.
Yeah.
And then I think about Job, on the other hand. So Job says, naked I came from the womb, naked I return. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. And so, I mean, the essence of that statement is that I had nothing when I arrived. I will leave with nothing. Whatever I have up to this point in life was given to me by God. And
Hmm.
if it's removed from me, then God isn't injuring me in any way because, he's only
Yeah.
taking that which belonged to him in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that's my approach when it comes to difficulties in life is that God owes me nothing.
Hmm.
If I'm suffering, it's not a injury to me on God's behalf, because I don't deserve anything from God. And
Hmm.
so it's not a real hopeful way to be, in a sense.
No, I get exactly where you're coming from because that was actually one of the hardest lessons that I have had to wrestle with in my entire life was the fact that God doesn't owe me nothing. Like He doesn't owe me anything. I actually like if anything, God owes me condemnation. like
Mm-hmm.
so, it's the fact that God gives me good things is a testament to His mercy.
Well, David, I will be honest with you. At my downswing, after having had a surgery and having my brain removed, being heavily medicated, and having lost my job with no source of income,
Yeah.
and all of the emotional um, and mental health problems that come from being an unemployed adult with a wife and children.
Yeah.
At my lowest points, it was pretty bad.
Yeah.
It was not good whatsoever. I don't want to paint myself as a stable human being. I've never done a thing that I behaved badly and regret, but I felt
Yeah.
things that I regret. Now, I
Yeah.
say all of that to say that even at the lowest of those times, which was pretty low, it never occurred to me to say, God's done this to me, or I'm angry at God, or anything like that.
Hmm.
I I I don't expect anything from God. And the name of your show, His Strength and Weakness, hails back specifically to a passage from Paul. I think it is in one of the Corinthians, in
Yeah.
which he says that he had this thorn in the flesh. He's
Yeah.
experiencing some kind of difficulty.
Hmm.
There's a huge debate over what that difficulty was, but it's a difficulty nonetheless. And he prays
Yeah.
to God, and God's answer to him is what?
My grace is sufficient for you.
That specifically means that God, it's John 3:16. God so loved the world, he gave his only son, whoever
Uh,
believes in him should not be condemned.
yeah.
Meaning that God has done something that was superfluous to to what he owed us, which was
Exactly.
eternal salvation. And that's
Hmm.
what he means by grace. It's that salvation. And
Yeah.
so what he's telling Paul there is if you're suffering and you still have that salvation, that's sufficient. The salvation is the
Mhm.
only gift I ever need give you to show that you are eternally accepted and blessed by me.
Exactly.
And you see the same thing being echoed in the story of the paralytic brought to Jesus. The paralytic is brought in, and one assumes that his friends all brought him there to get him healed. But the first thing Jesus says is, your sins are forgiven. And at that
Mhm.
point, Jesus was ready for him to, get dragged away, still very paralyzed. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, this is a man who is now has eternal life.
Yeah.
Physically, he's about as bad off as he could be.
Mhm.
But eternally, he's got way more benefit than the Pharisees standing in the room over there on their two functioning legs, you know,
Yeah.
yelling at Jesus for saying that.
Hmm.
Um, and the final point I will bring to that effect is that you'll see this event, the first temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. He's fasting. Now, think about this: you fast long enough, you're going to die.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Satan comes out, and Satan's like, turn these stones to bread, feed your physical needs, and satisfy those physical needs. And Jesus says no. God says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Now, this is a
Yeah.
reversal of how we think of things. We think, okay, take care of the physical needs first, then we'll hit the spiritual needs, um, because the body is first in priority over the soul.
Yeah.
But if man does not live by bread, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God, it means that the soulish, the spiritual benefits outweigh the physical ones.
Yeah.
If Jesus had died there and then in the wilderness, he would have gone to be with his Father in heaven,
Yeah.
um, which would be far better than being a well-fed individual who is not going to have that.
Yeah. That's
So,
true.
strength and
But yeah.
weakness,
Yeah.
it's that grace which is sufficient.
Yeah.
And that's what I keep in mind when I am going through these down periods, is that whatever I'm losing now, I still have God's grace.
Exactly. That's a really good point. Like I know that doesn't seem like I know that goes contrary to what a lot of Christians are taught in a lot of churches these days. Like I mean, I kind of reminds me of well, when Martin Luther came up with the idea of the theology of glory versus the theology of the cross. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, that's beyond me.
Like the essentially what he was saying was the theology of glory or the theology of the cross is meaning that we as Christians were called to a life of suffering. But in the midst of that suffering, there's meaning and purpose in that suffering, and that God is using it for his glory and for our good. And whereas the theology of glory says that as Christians, we're not supposed to suffer at all. We're supposed to live the good life and have a lot of blessings and be pretty much be the head, not the tail, and stuff like that. Like
Cough, Joel Osteen cough.
Yeah, exactly, Joel. Yeah. So Don Gant says, so she said, salvation is a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's not a religion. And then she quotes Romans 3:23. Yeah. Then she says, it is all divinely done, eternal life. Put all of your trust in the finished work of Jesus Christ. We put on Jesus' righteousness. We have none of our own. We totally depend on Jesus' atonement for sin. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, amen to that. By the way, I want to say thank you to Don for joining this stream and being in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Don.
Yeah. So the next question is, how has your faith affected the way you deal with your clients?
Okay, so that's a difficult one because I've worked exclusively in the public sector. Now, I need to say that the group home I worked with was sponsored by Catholic Charities.
Yeah.
But the Catholic Charities sort of philosophy in terms of that is, A, we don't, try to indoctrinate the children to any kind of religious perspective. And B, if they have a religious perspective other than Catholicism, then we support that because that's the background they come from. So, you were very much discouraged from kind of bringing your religion into your interaction with those students. And then the second school that I worked at was a public school, so no religion at all was sort of intended to be communicated to the students. You kind of kept your religion to yourself and open to whatever they want to say about their own religion, as long as they're not proselytizing or whatever. And I essentially, that's what I'm getting at, is that's just been the environments I've worked in. They were not religious environments. Even the place that I worked with, that was a Methodist location, played some lip service to religion when it came to like staff meetings and things, but not in the curriculum.
Did you ever have this experience where so I remember when I was in like juvenile detention and like the treatment center specifically, when I expressed that I was a Christian to a staff member, then that kind of opened up doors for them to be able to talk to me about Christianity and about the Bible and stuff like that. But they would just do that with me because I was already open, but they wouldn't do that with any of the other students. Is that like, did you have experiences like that, or?
I don't recall anything specific like that. Now, to expand on that just a little bit, in addition to theologies or doctrines, I bring principles into the workplace.
Okay.
And I don't have to abandon my principles just because I'm not working in a religious workplace. I continue to stick with the principles. And so in terms of that, my primary objective is the success of the person that I'm dealing with. It's exclusively been children and teenagers. So, I want them to succeed. I want them to feel safe. I want them, and that just happens to coincide with the philosophies of those centers as well, because it's recognized in general that these sort of Judeo principles of Judeo-Christian principles of respect and value of other human beings, and especially in a field like special education or mental health in general, actually, is you're dealing with individuals who are less able, less capable than the quote unquote neurotypical individual.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
true.
if we were operating on a solely Darwinian principle, then these individuals would be, the way they have been treated throughout history, sort of locked away until they passed away. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
just kind of shoved out of sight.
and that's actually how mentally ill people were treated back at like probably like over 100 years ago.
Yeah,
Like they were just shut away.
exactly.
Like,
We didn't
yeah,
know what to do with them because we didn't know what they were. We didn't know what was going on with them.
yeah,
They,
exactly.
they were different, but we didn't know why. Maybe demons. I don't know.
Yeah,
Anyway,
exactly. That
yeah.
actually, um, I'm glad you mentioned that. That like that actually I raises a question I wanted to ask you. What are your thoughts about Christians that say that mental disorders are demon possession?
Well, I'm hyper skeptical towards that.
Yeah,
Um, mental disorders should be treated as mental disorders first, and until I would give that an innocent until proven guilty approach, because I
yeah,
honestly don't know where I stand on the subjects of demons at all, and I'm very
yeah,
comfortable with where I stand on the subject of mental health. So,
yeah,
you know, um, I am not prepared to say that there categorically is no such thing as demons or demon possession, but I've never had any experience with it. I don't know what it looks like, and I do know what mental health difficulties look like.
yeah.
Um, so I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, but I'm unprepared to say that any sort of apparent mental health difficulty is demonic in nature until I'm proven otherwise.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said you think mental disorders should be treated as mental disorders first, though. Like I agree with that. Like I hate how a lot of Christians have this tendency to spiritualize things that don't need to be spiritualized. Like like I don't I mean, and I said this before. Like we wouldn't spiritualize a broken arm, so why would we spiritualize a mental disorder? Like, I mean,
That's a really interesting thing to see, because I think the church has this sense of inadequacy or competition with psychology. It's like, you
yeah,
know, if the psychologist gets their way, nobody will go to church because we'll all be feeling great. Like, and what does that say about
yeah, yeah,
Christianity? You know,
wow,
there has to be some value to it beyond being able to deal with mental and emotional crises. Now, having said all of that, there are multiple studies, and I've done a good deal of research into this, which show that there are, in fact, extreme mental health benefits of
hmm,
being of religion,
yeah,
um, and those tend to operate within two realms. One is the social realm, where a religious community provides you with a community of love and acceptance and
yeah,
shared values that have mental and emotional health benefits to it, because we're human beings. We need community.
yeah,
Even the ones of us who are, autistic and can't, function within a sort of community environment, still need that
yeah,
community. You will not
yeah,
find an autistic on earth that says, I hate being around people and I don't want to be loved.
yeah. That
No, they
goes
want to
right
be
back
loved.
to yeah, that goes right back to like the Garden of Eden when God said, looked at Adam and said, "It is not good for man to be alone."
And the people, there's a study I have in mind specifically called Religion and Well-Being, that didn't, this was not done by a religious organization or religious person.
Yeah,
This was a study that was done, and it looked at a lot of different religions, a lot of the most common religions. And it
yeah,
looked at the principles and sort of doctrines and things that each of them had that differed from each other, and how
hmm,
these affected mental and emotional health um, in those communities. And, religion was found to categorically be a good thing for mental health, um,
yeah,
regardless of which community you happen to be in. But
hmm,
certain communities had uh, deficits that came with them. So, for instance,
yeah.
um, Catholicism had this sort of stress or sort of feeling of inadequacy that came with
Hmm.
it, because of certain approaches that Catholics have to human nature and doctrine and so forth.
Yeah.
Judaism had sort of an inbuilt despair that came with it. Like, you're always looking forward to the return to the land, this future event, and you have this feeling of being an outcast. Now, bear in mind that Jews, more than any other sect, are very community focused, like extremely community focused. And there's things about sort of the ritualism of Judaism that makes you feel intimately involved in that community. So that feeling of being an outcast only goes one way. You're an outcast from the world, but you're extremely intimate with your own religious community. So there's sort of a balancing that goes there.
Yeah, I get that.
But studies have shown that people who are of a particular religious bent and live in a environment, country, community, whatever, which is doesn't have a lot of representation for that religion, have a higher degree of stress. So because they go out into I actually was having a conversation with an atheist about this very recently. So I'll give you the footnotes from that conversation. He's an atheist. He lives in the American South in the Bible Belt.
Okay.
And he feels very isolated in the Bible Belt because, he knows that any given individual he runs into on the street is probably going to hold values and convictions that are not the same as his.
Well, yeah. So he feels isolated. Yeah.
So he feels isolated in that environment because it's a very religious environment. He was telling me that they did morning prayers and Christian puppet shows in his school growing up, and it was a public school, and that was unique to me. Versus me.
It kind of reminds. Oh, sorry. Like I was gonna say, it kind of reminds me on a humorous note. It kind of reminds me of the Family Guy episode where Brian comes out as an atheist and everybody freaks out around him.
didn't see that episode, but
you didn't? Oh, okay.
I stopped watching that show quite a while ago.
Oh yeah,
it's an old show if you think about it.
Yeah, it is. I stopped watching it a while ago too, but I just remember that episode very clearly because I remember Brian came out and said, "Oh, I'm an atheist," and everybody freaked, the whole town freaked out on him because
yeah. Well, I live in Maryland, and Maryland is Baltimore's in the center of Maryland, and Washington D.C. is in the south of Maryland. So it's a very blue state. I'm sorry, blue state. And it's not a highly religious area like the Bible Belt would be.
Okay.
And so when I go out in public, I more or less assume that everybody I run into probably is not religious and probably isn't particularly friendly to religion, especially since religion in America is associated with politics. And since people in my state tend to be on the political left, they're openly hostile to religion because religion is associated with the political right. So, so I have sort of the opposite experience of him. So anyway,
but you definitely are similar because you probably also feel isolated.
Yeah, to a degree. Yeah, except that I have the benefit that religions have built-in communities. So whereas there's no atheist church for him to go to on Sundays, there is a Christian church for me to go to on Sundays. So I'm not as isolated as him because religion has that inbuilt community in it, which is a benefit for mental health.
It is interesting how you mentioned atheist churches because I was reading an article not too long ago. I guess there are a lot of atheist churches that are popping up in recent years. I
wouldn't say a lot of, but yes, there are.
Yeah, and I find that kind of interesting because it's like they know that, what you're saying, that there are benefits in being around in a social community.
Yeah. Atheism is a bad social community to be in, not because atheists are bad people or anything like that, but because the foundational principle of atheism doesn't exist. There is no foundational principle or positive belief system around which atheists rotate. Atheism rotates around a rejection of religion. And imagine getting together every Sunday and talking about how bad the other guy is.
That's true.
I mean, Christians and any belief system, really, any religious belief system gets to come together and talk about positive things, about things that they believe, which are benefits and good things. Atheism
Yeah.
doesn't have that built into it. And so
Yeah.
these quote unquote atheist churches either have to meet together and complain about religion, or they have to come up with some other kind of foundational principle that they can meet together and talk about positive things.
Yeah. Good
Secular
point.
humanism is the replacement for religion in these churches. But unfortunately, you can't quite escape the fact that the thing that's bringing you together with all of these other people, the thing that you have in common when you attend this thing, is that you all dislike religion.
Yeah.
And so the conversation is going to migrate back to that point at some point anyway.
That's
And
true.
so the community elements and benefits you get from religion just don't exist in atheism.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
could go
exactly.
to Comic-Con and get more community and, social support benefits out of, attending a Comic-Con with other comic fans than you could out of attending Atheist Con or SecuCon or whatever they call.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like
Yeah,
that's
so it
true.
just doesn't have
Oh,
that inbuilt.
real quick, I gotta take care of my ostomy bag real quick. So can you, just to fill in the dead air, can you just kind of like tell
I've got
people?
something. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Tell people what you like to do for fun or whatever. But yeah,
All right. So before I do that, I'm going to finish up the second point of my religion is good for the mental health thing by saying that there's another aspect of religion that you don't get out of most other sort of mental health practices, and that is this sense of sort of security and hope that transcends circumstance. So what I mean by that is this. No matter how bad things are in your circumstance, if you're religious, you believe that there is some greater cause, some greater purpose, some greater hope, and something that will outlast or outlive or sit above all of the bad things that exist in life. And having that common source of hope, that common source of purpose that exists above circumstance has extreme mental health benefits to it. And this exists for people even if they aren't themselves part of a religious community. The religious ideal, the idea that there is something beyond me and that something is a good thing, is a benefit. It's a solution. It's a treatment towards the bad things I'm experiencing in my mind and in my emotions and in my life. So, yes. And the whole purpose for me to get into the mental health benefits of religion was to counteract this idea that it's either psychology or religion. You can have both psychology and religion working hand in hand because religion actually does have health benefits built into it as a structure. And when emotional health or mental disabilities exceed those things that the church offers as mental health benefits, there's nothing wrong with pursuing psychology or therapy above and beyond that. All right, now that I've completed making that point, talking about what I like to do. So I was telling David, I don't remember if I mentioned this on the show or not, but I'm a very creative person. So the things that I like to do are creative things. I'm an artist, and you can find some of my art online. I share it on there. I've done professional art occasionally, not long, but I'd made some decent amount of money doing freelance art. Freelance writing and editing are my thing. That's what I love to do, and I do a good bit of that. If you were to Google my name, you'd find quite a bit of writing that I've done, and I've done editing in the past. One of my favorite things to do, though, recently is acting. I mentioned this earlier as well, that, I was involved in theater as a youngster, and I belong to an organization called American Immersion Theater. And American Immersion Theater actually does professional performances, and most of what they do are these sort of dinner show murder mysteries. So in one of these murder mystery events, I would be one of the hosts, and then the people attending would be given parts to play. And so random people are selected to do random parts, and as the night goes on, they play their part, and everybody tries to figure out who done it in the end. So, and our great esteemed host is back.
Yeah.
Hey, David.
I heard you talk about murder. I heard you talk about murder mysteries. My wife actually loves murder mysteries.
Yeah.
I I never been to one myself, but she wants to take me to one day.
Yeah, so Murder Mystery Company is the place to contact. So
Okay.
go on the web. They're a subcategory of a larger organization called American Immersion Theater, and
Oh,
the murder mystery events actually include the audience. So audience members are given parts to play in the show, and
nice.
so you go there. You might, you never know. You might get grabbed to play a part. Um,
Yeah.
and that's not
That's
as
nice.
challenging as you might think. You don't have to memorize a script or anything.
Yeah.
You just have to, be a businessman. When people talk to you,
Yeah.
that's who you are.
Well, it's called murdermystery.com.
So, Murder Mystery Company
Oh,
is the name of the
murdermystery.com.
group.
Okay.
But
Okay.
if you can't find them, look for American Immersion Theaters. American Immersion
Okay.
Theaters has a bunch of subcategories, and the Murder Mystery
Okay.
Company is one of them.
I'll definitely look that up. All right. So Don Gant says about salvation, the term chaotic moment means the right time, God's right timing for our salvation. Also, we need to stay grounded in the Word of God. Satan will take advantage of all our weaknesses. Submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you.
Okay.
I agree with that. Like I know one of the things that helps me with my delusions is like I remind myself of what the Bible says. So
Mm-hmm.
like one of the delusions I get is like I get delusions or also I hear voices that tell me that I'm God or that people are praying to me. And I just when I get those delusions or I hear those hallucinations, I just remind myself the Bible says there's only one God and I'm not him, and and then it doesn't necessarily mean that the delusions or the voices go away, but it does kind of like help me to remind myself of that so I don't slip into that mindset. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Now you're using the term delusions. Is that your own term, or did you pick that up somewhere?
Well, okay, so like what I mean by like
No, I know what you mean by it. I'm just that's an interesting label for it. I'm not sure I've heard. I know the word delusions. I've
well,
seen
I
it
kind
used.
of I
I
guess
don't
a
know if I've
better
seen it used professionally or not.
I guess a better word would be intrusive thoughts.
Okay, intrusive thoughts I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that'd be a better word.
I mean, in the professional field, there are certain words we would avoid because they seem derogatory or they seem like a put down and so forth. And I would think
Oh,
delusion would be one of those taboo words that you wouldn't use, just
that
because.
makes sense. I guess I just kind of I just got used to saying it like
And that's
so.
fine. I mean,
Yeah,
if you're okay with that, I'm okay with it. But
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I'm TBI. I'm not brain damaged. I'm traumatic
yeah,
brain injury, but I'm really
yeah.
brain damaged. It's just not a term I use.
Yeah, I definitely there are certain words that I try to avoid. Like I never I don't like the word crazy or
Mhm.
insane. Like those words, I try to stay away from those words because I know they just
Do you
kind
know
of
that
feel
insane was never a psychological term at all?
really,
It's a legal term.
huh? Well, I know.
Criminally insane is a
Yeah,
legal term, but insanity was never
okay.
a psychological term at all.
That actually makes sense. It kind of reminds me of like I really don't like it like the word psychopath. And I don't know if you're familiar with David Wood, but
Hmm.
he uses that to refer to himself. And like
Yep.
I get it. Like I mean, like I think what he means though when he uses the word psychopath is sociopath. And I kind of wish he would just say sociopath because to me, psychopath just sounds kind of derogatory. Like, but
So both of those are subcategories of a uh, antisocial personality disorder. Um,
yeah.
and antisocial personality disorder does have subcategories, and psychopath is one of those
Oh, it
subcategories.
is.
Now, the fact, what you're referring to is a phenomena that we see in psychology quite a bit, and it's unfortunate. You can come up with a technical term to refer to something, and then people take that technical term and they turn it into an insult. And
Yeah,
so
that's what I mean.
the,
Yeah,
the technical term becomes useless at some point if you're going to be treating something because just saying it sounds like an insult. So, for instance, we've long since done away with the term retarded. Retarded used to be a technical term, but it's become so derogatory that saying it can be triggering.
That's interesting.
It's an insult now, and so they have to come up with a new term. And before retarded, they use the word moron, and they use the word idiot, and both of those have become derogatory terms. So, but yeah,
so
the difference between
is actually a technical term then?
Yeah, psychopath is a diagnosis that you can get in antisocial personality disorder. The difference between psychopath and sociopath is they believe that psychopathy is something you're born with. It's sort of a neural makeup. And sociopath is something
more environmental.
Yeah, it's something you develop.
Yeah.
And so I don't know the degree to which those things are true, but there are also some behavioral differences between psychopathy and sociopathy. And psychopathy tends to be more subtle. Psychopath usually has more control, and they're able to play the long con, if you will. They're able to plan things out and to set things up in an order to achieve a goal that they want. Sociopathy tends to be more emotional, or a psychopath you would associate with being very controlled. Sociopathy is associated with like outbursts of rage, getting into fights. Both psychopathy and sociopathy don't have a lot of respect for social conventions or laws. So you see a lot of illegal behavior out of both of them. And I've listened to David Wood talk about his time before he went to prison, and some of the illegal things that he did. So you saw it in those behaviors. But the difference is that psychopathy, again, tends to be more subtle, and they tend to get away with it because, in psychopathy, they recognize that there are social orders, there are conventions, there are laws and things, and these just become a means to the end. So they learn to work with the system. One of the kids that I worked with in the group home was very young. He was maybe about 7 when I was working with him. And he had not been diagnosed because I was working in a diagnostic unit, but I would place all the money I have on it that he was a psychopath. And I recognized this in a lot of ways, but one of them was the fact that he was always kind of reading, engaging the behavior and emotions of the people around him. So, he would do something to get in trouble, and he would be doing it on the sly, trying to get away with it. And if he got caught, and he didn't always, he was a slick kid. But if he got caught, he'd be like, "Oh, you got me. How did you know?" And
so he was kind of manipulative then.
Yeah. He was trying to determine, he was trying to learn how to be a better criminal. By figuring out how he had been caught and then learning how to get around that. And one time this really came to my attention. He had done something to get caught in school. And so I had been called from the school to pick him up and bring him back to the group home. And so I went and I picked him up, and we were driving back, and he's just kind of like staring at my face. And I'm driving, he's staring at my face, and he eventually asks, "Mr. Joel, are you angry?" Now, he asked this because he figured, he'd just done something to get in trouble, and I had to leave and pick him up and bring him back. And so maybe anger would be a thing that I was feeling. But he had to learn how to read me. So he was looking at my facial expressions, and then he was trying to associate them with the emotion, and he just wanted to make sure if he'd made the right analysis. And so I wasn't angry. I actually enjoyed getting away from the group home and driving out, so...
It
was a nice experience for me, but I realized what he was doing. He was trying to diagnose me, and that's your psychopaths for you. They learn how to put on a front. Psychopaths can be very charming people, because they learn how to act, and they can replicate any kind of human behavior or emotion that gets them to the end that they're trying to achieve. So
that's why, you got to be careful when you're dealing with them.
One of the kids that I worked with in the Board of Child Care was a diagnosed sociopath.
Really?
Yeah, and the behaviors that you see between the two of them are very similar. So it's not something like the kid I was dealing with. He may have been sociopathic, and I was just calling it psychopathic. He was definitely a social personality disorder, though.
Yeah.
But the other kid, he's this cute kid, and he would be your best friend. He come, he'd been out. This was COVID times. So he had only recently returned to school, so I had just met him, and he'd been on my caseload in my classroom for years. Not years, I'm sorry, for months. And so I first meet him, and like one of the first things he tells me is, "You're my favorite teacher."
Yeah.
But then,
Well,
as soon as I wasn't around, he'd be telling everybody how nasty I'd been to him and all the things I did
yeah.
because he liked getting people in trouble. So that was his deal. He would cozy up to people and, get real friendly with them. And then when they weren't around, he'd try to get them in trouble. And he did
Yeah.
that with me a couple times. He was coming in and reporting his grandmother for abuse like daily
Oh, wow.
because, she wasn't abusive to him, but he knew that as state employees, we had to report
We had a
any
report.
reports of physical abuse or abuse in
Yeah.
general to the state. We were required to. So if he said it every day, he'd be getting, or his grandmother would be getting reported every day, and social services
Wow.
would be camped out on his lawn.
Ah,
They thought that was great.
wow. Yeah.
So
That's. I would like to now. Hearing this actually makes me want to like interview someone with sociopathic that's been diagnosed as a
antisocial
sociopath.
personality disorder.
Yeah, exactly. I want to I want to interview someone with that. Like, I mean,
Well,
I've always wanted to interview someone with DID, but now I kind of want to interview someone with antisocial personality disorder. Like,
uh, David Wood's a hard catch.
yeah, I know.
I've tried getting a hold of him a couple of times for different things that I've been doing, and he's a difficult
Yeah.
man to pin down. I met him once, but it was
Oh,
at a
really?
conference, and he wouldn't recognize me now, unless,
Yeah.
in addition to antisocial personality disorder, he's also got some kind of photographic memory.
Yeah.
But I
Speaking
doubt
about David Wood, I watched his debate with Matt Dillahunty,
it. Okay.
and there was a part in the debate that I just like laughed because, like, in the debate, Matt Dillahunty asked David Wood, if you stopped being a Christian today, would you go back to being a psychopath? And David Wood, I mean, he answered honestly. He said, probably. And Matt Dillahunty was like, well, then I don't want you to stop believing in God. And I was like, wait a second. Don't you say that we should seek truth no matter what? Now you're telling him that you're okay with him possibly living with a delusion as long as you're safe?
Yeah, this is really interesting because in my interactions with atheists, my thought has been, all right, look, why would you want somebody to stop being religious?
Yeah.
Well, because it's obviously untrue. All right, so you say that truth is superior to emotional feeling good.
Yeah.
If you had to choose between believing a delusion and being happy, or believing the truth and being sad, you would prefer believing the truth and being sad. And they
Hmm.
would say ultimately yes. And I said, okay. And why is truth more important than emotion?
Hmm.
And that's a question they can't answer.
Yeah, that's a
But
good
I can
question.
answer that. I know why truth is more important than emotion.
Yeah. Because God is truth.
Yep.
Yeah.
But if atheism is true, then I don't see any reason why not to be religious and continue to believe a delusion if it fulfills me.
Yeah. That's a
Really
good
don't.
point. I gotta remember that question because that's a really good question. Like I gotta like
Well, it
oh
ties directly back into what David Wood said.
yeah, exactly. It does.
Now, I'll tell you one thing. Okay, so the autistic guy that I'm thinking of hooking you up with, you may have heard of him. He's pretty active in the apologetics community. Nick Peters.
That
No,
name
yes,
sounds familiar, but I'm
yeah.
not sure.
He's probably on your. He probably pops up on your social media feed because he's very active.
Okay.
Um, he has Asperger's, which is a sort of high functioning autism,
Okay.
um, and he compares himself to Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. He says,
Oh yeah, yeah,
that's essentially what Sheldon does is essentially Asperger's. So
yeah.
I'll defer to his expertise on that. At any rate, he doesn't often debate, but he did once. And I have a recording of that debate I get to hear, and it was against Matt Dillahunty.
Oh no.
So here's the interesting thing. You'll notice, having listened to a number of debates, that it seems as if there's a common approach that the atheist will take in the debate. And that approach is to sort of have a hyper confidence, almost like an arrogance, you might say.
Yeah.
And so they tend to sell their argument. I mean, and the Christian participant generally tries to bring in sort of arguments and reasons and things like that primarily. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the atheist will bring in rhetoric. They'll bring in sort of a swagger and a rhetoric, and and they tend to dominate the debate by confidence and by stage presence and by those kinds of things. And I mean, that is true. As humans, we're attracted to confidence.
Yeah.
And we're attracted to rhetoric, and having that stage presence will do a lot for you. And it can, in a formal debate, it can be very intimidating if, you're facing down an opponent who's so confident that, everything they say is almost a certainty.
Yeah.
David Wood is unhindered by that kind of thing because,
That's
again,
true.
He doesn't have that sort of empathetic attachment to other human beings. And so, whereas practically any other human being in the world would be intimidated by somebody coming at them with that kind of extreme confidence, David Wood doesn't. And David Wood almost adopts that same kind of swagger and confidence on stage.
Yeah.
And again, that's because, psychopaths are able to mimic those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But psychopaths tend to be very confident in general.
That makes sense. Kind of like, I mean, I know James White is kind of like that too. I'm not saying James White's a psychopath, but like
he may or may not be. There are more of them in the world than you may think.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I know James.
They're good at blending in and hiding, unlike an autistic person or somebody with.
Oh, really?
Schizophrenia.
Well, I know, like James White, he's very if you watch his debates, he's very confident and and he doesn't back down. I mean, I've seen atheists try and push against him, and he just pushes right back.
I think that ends up counting against him. I've heard a lot of people say that he seems kind of arrogant and condescending and so forth. I don't listen to him a lot, so I don't know much about it. But I was circling back to this.
Oh, sorry.
I was circling back to this point with Nick Peters, because Nick Peters has Asperger's, and one of the things of Asperger's is you're not able to pick up on social conventions and things. So he's not intimidated by the sort of confidence and stage presence either, but it's the opposite. It's because he doesn't even see it. He's not aware of the sort of confidence and swagger and intimidation that they're adopting on stage. So it doesn't faze him at all because he doesn't actually recognize that it's happening.
He doesn't notice it. Yeah.
Yeah. So both of them have a benefit in debate because they're not affected by this sort of confidence and swagger and, arrogance brought against them for different reasons, basically based on.
I would like to listen to that discussion between him. Is there a way I can listen to that discussion between him and Matt Dillahunty?
I'll see if I can't get you that link.
Okay. All right. Cool. Thank you. So the next question I had: what is something you would like other Christians to know about mental illness?
I would like them to not taboo it. I don't. It's depressing and disturbing to me that Christianity can sometimes discourage people from getting treatment for mental health.
Yes.
It's not a taboo. But I'd also like them to know the reverse, that being in a supportive community can be the best kind of medicine for somebody with mental health. And don't act as if they don't have it, because they do. It's not helpful to pretend that they're quote unquote normal. This is something they're suffering with. They want to be recognized for that. They don't want to blend into the crowd and say that, no, you don't have a disability.
Yes.
Because you do. You do. and it deserves to be recognized, and it deserves to get the same kind of love and respect as everybody else in the church.
Yes, exactly.
If somebody's house burnt out in the fire, you would be praying for that person. You'd be on their doorstep offering to help. You'd be there to support them. It's like that, but it's chronic. Mental health is a chronic thing. It doesn't go away. But it can exist in a supportive environment and become tolerable. And as the title of your show indicates, God's strength is revealed in our weakness. Those of us with mental health issues can actually do more for the kingdom of God than those without in circumstances.
That's exactly, that's exactly right. I know, like I've had experiences like in churches where, cause I'm very open about my mental illness, and well, that's when people first meet me, one of the first things I tell them is that I have a mental illness, not because I want attention for it, but because I want people to know this is the type of person I am, and just so they can understand me better. And when I notice that when I tell people this, they either have the reaction where they don't want nothing to do with me, or they have the reaction where they are overly sympathetic. And I think both of those responses I think are wrong. I don't want people to ignore me, but at the same time I don't want over sympathy.
Well, here's what I would think about that, David. The way they're acting towards you is the kind of thing that happens at a funeral. You go to a funeral and there's a person who's lost a loved one. They're devastated.
Yeah.
You want to be there for them, but you have absolutely zero ideas what to say to them. So you do what you can. You say, I'm sorry. Maybe you give them a hug. Maybe you avoid them. But you don't know what they need or want to hear. The same thing is true when you're a person who meets another person that is having some kind of emotional or mental health difficulty. They don't know what to say to you. They are out of their element. And so they use a go-to. Their go-to is maybe avoid it, maybe be overly sympathetic to it. But that's not their fault. They're not mental health professionals. They don't know what to do. They just want to try to do something and they don't know what it is. So what you do is you tell them what you need.
Yeah.
You say, this is what this is my condition, and this is what helps me with my condition when people do it for me. That helps them because they need help too. They need help. You don't know how to deal with what you're going on with you. They don't know how to do what's going on you. You're both in the same boat. So throw them a bone, give them a clue.
Yeah.
Don't blame it on them because they don't know what to do.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's a good point. I do need to understand that these people, most people probably, I mean, mental illness is common, but most people probably don't know about mental illness. So therefore, since they don't deal with it in their regular day-to-day basis, they don't even think about it.
I mean, like my particular type of mental illness, I can blend in with a crowd because the kinds of side effects with it are things like memory. That becomes outstanding if you have to spend a lot of time with me or work with me. And you notice that I'm not able to recall things as well as I thought it should. But also, it's emotional in nature.
That makes sense.
If you don't have to spend a lot of time in a room with me, then you won't notice that. Because, brain damage, you would associate brain damage with a deficiency in intelligence. And I don't think I display that much.
Yeah.
I think I'm still fairly competent. And I can carry on a conversation and not look like I have some kind of emotional or mental health difficulty.
I was gonna ask you, with your because you said before that that part of your brain is missing because it was taken out, and because of that you struggle with memory problems. How does that affect your studies, when you're doing your research and stuff?
So the difficulties that I have tend to be more of short-term recall, and they are Everybody in the world has had the condition where you've walked into a room and you can't remember why you came into that room.
Okay.
Or you see, somebody comes up and says, "Hi, David," and you don't remember this
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
It's like that, except more frequent
Hmm.
and with a lot more
Okay.
things.
Oh, okay. Okay, that makes sense. So
So
you
that doesn't.
could. So it
Go
doesn't
ahead.
really affect your research then.
No, I mean, if it's a topic that I'm interested in, and if I, write and research on it, then I can organize my thoughts and I can recall it because that goes into long-term memory.
Okay.
Short-term recall is the difficulty.
So like, and so for instance, you might forget like what you said 10 minutes ago. Like,
Yeah. Or
okay.
I mean, what's happened during this conversation a couple of times, I had to have you remind me
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
what
Yeah.
what I was responding
That
to.
that actually like I can okay, so I can see how like how you said you can blend in with people because I know a lot of people that are like that where they'll like they'll act like and I've done this too where like I'll like ask people hey well can you repeat that to me or like so I think that like yeah that I don't like that's actually fairly common I think don't like right
Yeah, yeah.
yeah
So
oh
I mean, I find myself quite a bit sitting around, not remembering why I'm sitting around, and having to tell myself, like verbally say, "All right, focus, Joel. What are you doing here?" And then when I give
oh
myself those verbal prompts, I'm usually able to bring back why I'm doing what I'm doing and so forth.
that
But
makes a lot of sense I
I
get
don't
that.
think the memory stuff is severe.
Yeah,
I've definitely seen worse.
yeah, of
I'm not Drew
course.
Barrymore in 51st Dates.
Yeah, that was actually a pretty good movie. I, I saw it for the first time like last year because like when I was in the hospital, all I could do laying in bed was watch movies. So
Uh-huh.
I actually watched 51st Dates for the first time like last year. Like, and I thought
Yeah.
that was a pretty good movie. Like,
Well, a schizophrenic, if they're well medicated and well adjusted, can blend in with a crowd as well. The
yeah,
kinds of things that
exactly.
happen, are usually private events, things that only you are aware of, and you don't have to make those public to anybody around you. Now, if
That's
you're not
true.
well
Yeah,
medicated and you're not well adjusted, like homeless population, you can
yeah,
see the person behaving in strange ways that might indicate that
that's
they
true.
are, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
that's actually interesting because, like, like okay, so my mom before she went to be with the Lord, she struggled with schizoaffective disorder too, just like me.
mhm,
And I the difference is my mom's schizophrenia wasn't treated; she refused to get treated, and
mhm,
I am treated. So people tell me all the time that they can't even tell that I have a mental illness.
mhm.
But when people looked at my mom, they can clearly tell that she did have schizophrenia because she was constantly talking to her voices and
Mhm.
like she was acting abnormal and like it was definitely interesting to see that contrast and
Yeah, and
um
that's among the reasons why we should not encourage Christians to not seek treatment for these things because treatments have effects.
exactly
They're effective. And they're not
yeah
hurting you spiritually. You're running a podcast trying to help Christians with difficulties.
exactly
You're doing the
so
Lord's work.
yeah thank you
Okay.
so my okay this question is actually one of my favorite questions that I like to ask okay, so I've come under the conviction that okay, so according to John chapter 9 with the man born blind, Jesus said the man was born blind not because of the man's sin or because of his parents' sin, but so that the glory of God can be displayed in him. So my question is, how do you think the glory of God is displayed in mental illness?
Okay. So this is a really good question because it again circles back around to the virtue of your show and your ministry. What you're
Yeah,
doing is that you're taking what people like myself and you who are blending into a crowd, and you're bringing it out,
yeah,
and that's a good thing because there's a lot of people who are blending into the crowd that aren't able to come out and share.
yes,
And you will never find a person with a mental health problem that doesn't want to talk about it to someone.
yeah, that's
It's a
true.
thing that support is needed. Maybe a psychopath, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just because other people don't mean that much to them. But anyway,
Yeah.
my point is that, first of all, your God's strength is being revealed through you because you're taking your mental health difficulty and turning it into a ministry which is benefiting other people. I assume you've got people following you.
Yeah.
And I would certainly hope that God is blessing it to that degree.
Yeah, I hope so too. Like,
there are people who have, in becoming involved in the mental health field, become more attracted to Christianity because of the sort of empathy and human worth that it gives to people.
yeah.
You know, I mean, as much as I'd like to think I'm concerned about the homeless person who's like holding the sign and trying to stop my car to get money from me, you know, they're at that very moment, there's an inconvenience about them that makes them irritating rather than a subject of sympathy. Giving human worth to those individuals is an important thing.
Yeah, that's true.
And Christianity provides us worth that no other worldview can.
Exactly. Like, because
Please
we
continue.
understand
I mean, okay, yeah, that passage you brought up, that blind man, he is part of religious history for 2,000 years now.
yeah.
That man has lived far beyond his years.
And
And that story that he participates in has made him a blessing to untold millions of people.
Yeah, exactly.
God's glory was benefited through his story.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, speaking about the homeless, like I really like when I see like mentally ill people that are homeless, like my heart like breaks for them, because like I know that homeless person that's on the street talking to himself, he is completely alone. Like, he's been completely abandoned by his family. His friends have abandoned him. Like, he has absolutely no one, and it's like,
it's just him and his brain, and it's not a very pleasant company.
exactly. And it's just sad. I get angry when like people look at him like he's some kind of freak and he needs to be avoided. I'm like,
and he gets angry when people look at him that way too.
yeah,
The autistic man that I work with in home, he's nonverbal.
yeah,
He's got a vocabulary of maybe 16 words, and they're all just very brief kind of responses.
yeah,
He very recently in his life, within the last, say, 5 or 6 years, began using a spelling board, and that's just a laminated board with the alphabet on it. And
yeah,
even though he's not able to talk, he is able to spell things out using that board. And it turns out that, you know, here's a full-grown man who's sitting there watching the Wiggles each day and throwing a fit and stuffing pizza in his face and, you know, acting as if he is a child. But when he's able to spell things out, he's very articulate. He has some deep thoughts and feelings about things like science and philosophy and things that you would never get from his behavior.
yeah.
He's an entirely different person on the inside. That person is not able to get out.
That actually makes a lot of sense. Like,
and you know, I mean,
I've always heard that autistic people are actually very highly intelligent. Like,
well, that's overgeneralization.
oh, really? Oh,
yeah. I mean, it's the way the brain works. Autistic people tend to hyperfixate, and if the thing they're hyperfixating on is a subject that is intensely intellectual, then they can be intensely intellectual.
Oh, okay.
So I mean,
that actually makes sense. Like, because I know, like when it comes to like people that have like mental illness, like I know, okay, for instance, like schizophrenia, like we tend to have like focus points, and whatever our focus point is, we can know a whole lot of in that focus area, and then we don't know like really anything in another area. Like for instance, my focus point tends to be like kind of like theology and philosophy.
Okay, let me ask you this question about that. Does that come and go, or are you pretty steady with that?
I think I'm pretty steady with it. Like,
okay, so with autism, and I suppose with I don't know much about schizoaffective disorder.
Yeah.
It's not my field. I've read on it occasionally, but
Yeah.
I've never worked with anybody, and I don't have the background knowledge that I do in some of these other fields.
Yeah.
But um, attention deficit disorder, which is also something I have, uh,
Yeah.
they do the same thing. They hyperfixate on things.
Hmm.
They become very energetic and involved and intense in a subject, but
Yeah.
it's extremely brief. And so what
Hmm.
you'll find if you talk to somebody who has a fairly intense case of ADHD is that they've done a number of brilliant projects in their life, but they never finished any of them. And
Yeah.
they just leave a trail of unfinished projects
Yeah.
behind them. And again, the ability to hyperfixate actually allows you to accomplish some really effective things.
Yeah.
So, if when you see somebody with attention deficit disorder do a thing that they're hyperfixating on, it's usually pretty brilliant. It just never
Yeah.
gets finished, never gets completed.
That's
All,
actually that actually makes sense because like that's actually a sign of like mania too. Is like if someone that's manic can like get a comp can like not can start a lot of projects, but then they
Mhm.
never finish them too. Like
Yeah, my roommate in college had bipolar disorder.
okay,
Because
okay,
I knew that he had mania. I didn't know that he had depression because he would just sit there and watch TV or take a long nap every time he was on the downswing.
oh
So
okay,
he only ever came out during the upswing, and that's when I saw him. So I thought he was just manic.
yeah. You thought he was just manic. That makes sense. Like I
But
was gonna
yeah, so
I was gonna
um,
say. Oh, sorry. Go
yeah,
ahead.
I was just finishing that thought. The hyperfixation that comes with autism
Yeah.
allows a person to become extremely effective in their very specific field.
Hmm.
So Nick Peters, he's a Christian apologist, and that's just basically what he does. But
Yeah.
he does a podcast as well, and it's on apologetics. But he interviewed a astrophysicist who has
Oh,
autism.
nice.
He's a Asperger's as well. And this
Okay.
astrophysicist was talking about going to these astrophysics conferences or these mathematical conferences where you have all of these specialists in the same room. And he says you'll have most of them standing against the wall, just kind of looking down at their shoes because um, autism is overrepresented in these conferences.
Yeah.
There's a higher percentage of autistic people present in these fields and in these conferences
That's
than in other
interesting.
fields because that particular mental condition lends itself to being very accomplished in these very specific fields.
That actually, wow, that's I would have never thought that before, but that makes a lot of sense. Like, like
Yeah.
I guess I never really thought about it.
Mhm.
Like I know, like okay, so like I said, I'm really good at like my focus point is theology and philosophy. Like, but then if you were to like quiz me on like math, like I probably look like the biggest idiot because I struggle with like even like the most basic math. like I'm all I have to count my fingers like just to do like basic math. Like and it's
It
just
happens. Math is
yeah like
not a there's more people that are good at literature than in math. Let's just put it that way.
yeah, that's
It's a
true.
difficult field. It's everybody's least favorite subject. But
Yeah,
autism spectrum disorder, you really can't just lump them all into one category. It's a spectrum.
yeah,
They're represented across the board, and you can't just say that all autistic people are geniuses in a field. That's not
yeah.
necessarily true.
I get that, and I wasn't trying to do that when I said I that's just it's common. Like I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, autistic people are really smart," and like
Yeah.
I don't know enough about autism to like they say whether or not that judgment is true or not. Like I just go off of what I just was going off of what I heard from what people have said. But
Well, I mean, it's not untrue that a lot of very ingenious people are also autistic, usually
yeah,
Asperger's.
okay,
But
that makes
you know,
sense.
just because a high percentage of people that are really smart are also autistic doesn't mean that a
Yeah.
high percentage of autistic are really smart. At
Yeah.
least not in a measurable sense.
I get that, and I do appreciate that you said it's not good to like lump all like I like how you said that autism is a spectrum, like that I can understand because schizophrenia is also a spectrum too,
Mm-hmm.
like that like in schizophrenia they have like schizotypal disorders,
Yeah.
schizoaffective, and yeah, like but yeah, so what can the body of Christ do in order to destigmatize mental illness in the church and the world?
Make it more visible in the church is what I would do.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, again, it's a chronic condition that we have so many people with their heads down, keeping to themselves,
Yeah.
because it's been impressed upon us that we're not really able or allowed to share our
Yeah.
disabilities with the world. And to a degree, it's not necessarily because the church would be like, schizoaffective disorder, get away.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
more along the lines of what you're saying, where it's stigmatized. They don't know what to do. And that's
Yeah.
the second thing. In addition to not making it invisible any longer, make it visible. Make it clear how it is that we are to treat these people.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I say
That's
these
a
people, including myself therein. So
yeah.
uh,
That's a good point. Like it's
include us.
yeah.
Because
That's a
if you
good
don't know how to treat them, what do you do? And I
yeah.
mean, ultimately, it's not that difficult. You treat them the way you would with anybody else who needs sympathy.
Yeah.
You let them tell you what they want to do and what they want to hear, what
Yeah.
they need, what their emotional needs are.
I definitely am like saddened by the fact when I think about how the world, like the secular world, is actually doing a lot more by way of helping out mentally ill people than the church is. It seems like the church is really good in helping out people that are like homeless or drug addicts or
Mm-hmm.
like in those categories, like, but then when it comes to like mentally ill people, it's like the church like lacks like, and that's not to say that all churches are like that, because there are some churches out there that are doing stuff for mentally ill people. I think of Rick Warren's church, Saddleback Church. Like I heard that they actually have a lot of stuff that they're doing for mentally ill people, and
Mm-hmm.
like, but overall it seems like the body of Christ like doesn't really do much for mentally ill people.
And that's not because they don't want to, it's because they don't know how to. You have to give them
Yeah,
the tools. The reason
exactly.
that the church is so effective in dealing with things like homelessness and um, illness, the various things that they do, is because they require money. Those are
Mhm.
problems you can solve by giving time and resources.
Yeah,
And if they had the tool, if they had similar tools to help people with mental health problems, they would be providing those tools. They would be providing those services as well. Psychology has been stigmatized in the church for a very long time.
yes,
And part of that, well, I mean, that has two parts to it. The one is because psychology used to be sort of a therapy, I mean, you can find all kinds of psychological advice in scripture. So it was sort of built into this, how we take care of people and how we deal with
yeah,
their emotions and feelings and so forth. Um, and then it became systematized. It became a science.
yeah,
And there has been a unfortunate cold war between religion and science for a very long
mm,
time. So once
yeah,
psychology moved from sort of a wisdom kind of thing, a treatment of people,
yeah,
into a science, it became kind of stigmatized as, well, it's not religious, it's not
yeah,
spiritual, it's one of
yeah.
those
That's true.
things. And then
It does.
it
Oh,
returned the insult because people like Skinner and Freud started trying to explain religious impulses
oh
by way of
yeah,
psychology. And
yeah,
so there became a sort of artificial standoff between the two, because
mhm,
the church perceives psychology as saying that religion isn't real.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
it's a mental delusion or something like that. And psychology perceives religion as being anti science, anti psychology. And
Yeah,
so
that's a good
that
point.
that
Like,
wall needs to be broken down. The church needs to be equipped with the ability, the tools to help people with mental health. If they are, they will do it. It's
that's
within
true.
their nature.
That's a good point. But I feel like so many pastors, like I think in order for churches to get like that, pastors have to be more open to learning about psychology. And I feel like a lot of pastors, like, it seems like a lot of pastors aren't willing to learn about psychology because they see, like, I don't know if they're afraid of psychology, or if they're just antagonistic because they think, because, like, I know a lot of pastors think psychology is anti-biblical, and like,
Mhm.
and like, I don't know. I personally, I like the study of psychology. I've kind of gotten into like studying about like the relationship between Christianity and psychology. And I've been getting into like a lot of like Christian psychology. Like,
Mhm.
I'm reading a book right now, by this book right here by Dr. Mark McMinn.
Okay.
Um, like, and he actually talks a lot about like psychology from a Christian perspective, and I think it's quite fascinating. Like, but I don't understand why so many pastors are like opposed to this idea. Like,
There's a number of reasons, and we've covered most of them already. There's this idea
yeah,
that your problems are spiritual, not mental or physical.
yeah, that's
Um,
true.
there's this the church to a degree has kind of a defaults to kind of karma idea sometimes. You
Yeah,
know, the idea that if something's going wrong with you, it's because you're wrong with the Lord. And this is never more
yeah,
strongly than with mental difficulties
yeah,
because, if your house burns down, a Christian probably isn't likely to say, "Oh, well, God's just punishing you for something." Usually a
yeah,
Christian's likely to say, "Well, life happens. Let's get you to a point where you're
hmm,
settled again." But if you're struggling emotionally or like with your temper or something like that, all of that is in your behavior and your mind, and behavior
yeah,
is associated with, sin or rightness with God.
yeah,
Um, and so if we can start to identify behavior as what it is, it's the movement of the organism, if you will, um,
yeah,
and allow that people can behave in a certain way for reasons other than just sin and salvation.
yeah.
Um,
That makes
and
sense.
that's the other thing is that if you're having some kind of like one of the side effects of my medication, my brain surgery, or both, is that I have less control over my feelings, my
Hmm.
emotions. Specifically, I have less self control when it comes to anger, which is not
Yeah,
great when you work with kids. Um,
yeah,
Now, if I were to take that out of context, if you were to see me as a person who was exploding into anger at the drop of a hat, you, as a Christian, you might almost read that as me being sinful in some way. I have
hmm.
a bad temper and it's because I've chosen to be mad and I'm sinful or something like that. Lashing
Yeah,
out in anger is sinful. Lashing out in anger is hurtful to other people. You shouldn't do it. It is a
yeah.
bad behavior, but it could also have underlying conditions that feed into it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I've always learned like that anger is a secondary emotion. That if you're feeling angry, then there's probably most likely an underlying emotion that's under the anger.
Yeah, and
Um,
with
but
explosive anger especially, it's not like a person considered the situation and then made a choice to explode. That just happened.
yeah, that's actually one of my biggest gripes against, and I kind of brought this up to you before the stream about that. One of my biggest complaints about nuthetic counseling is they try and grind, they not grind, they try and ground um mental illness. They try and ground it in not in a chemical imbalance in the brain, they ground it in a person's individual sin.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and they say that if you're experiencing mental problems, mental or emotional problems, it's because of your individual sin. And if all you need to do is confess that sin, and you'll be better.
Yeah, and that's that karma. That's the idea of karma, that you
Yeah,
suffer because you did something bad. That's the whole book of Job, is they're sitting around and telling Job that he's experiencing karma because of something bad he did.
yeah,
And
exactly.
we the reader knew that that wasn't the case. God
Yeah,
specifically
exactly.
complimented him for being a righteous guy.
Exactly. Like
So as
that's
Christian, I mean, as Christians, I would point out to the noetic counselor, do you believe in karma?
that's
Because what you
true.
just told me is karma.
That's a good point. It's definitely, and and I know, I don't know what denomination you are, but I know nouthetic counseling is really popular in in the Reformed denomination. Like, I actually refer to nouthetic counseling as the golden calf of Reformed Christians, because,
Mm-hmm.
like, I noticed when I started speaking out against nouthetic counseling, I got a lot of backlash from a lot of Reformed Christians. Like, but
Well, David, have you ever heard especially a skeptic atheist, somebody point out that, well, the church has so many different denominations that, if it was the true religion, it wouldn't be so
yeah, I've
divided and
heard
everything.
that. Yeah,
Okay. Well,
but
yes.
I was gonna say my response to that when they said that is like, yeah, there's so many different denominations, but we all agree on the essential stuff. Like, what we disagree on are non-essential things.
Well, I would say that it's a good thing, not a bad thing, that we have so many different
Yeah,
denominations, let's say, because it allows for a marketplace of ideas in which the good ideas will rise to the top and the bad
hmm.
ideas will diminish. Having
Yeah,
this, it allows for a balance in the church, because, yes, if your um, denomination was the only denomination, the noetic counseling or nothetic counseling might get
yeah,
off the ground and never have anybody stand to offer an alternative to it.
that's true.
But
Exactly.
because we have a marketplace of ideas, because we have a Christianity in which you get to hear different perspectives on the same issue and then make your
Yeah,
own mind up, there's a
yeah,
freedom of thought inherent in the Western Christian system that is not
yeah.
inherent in things like Catholicism, where it's sort of a monolithic church that controls all thought.
Hmm. That's that.
Ecumenicism is a good thing, not a bad thing.
I agree. It really is. Like, actually, my old pastor, who's with the Lord now, but he one of the lessons he taught me when I first became Reformed, he said, when Reformed theology goes bad, they start doing exactly what Rome did, and that's they declare themselves to be the only true church. Like, a truly Reformed position says that we're not the only truth, that we acknowledge the universal church, which is the body of Christ. And, like, yeah, we may disagree on stuff, but just because you're not Reformed, that doesn't mean you're not a Christian. Like, and, like, so, but yeah, so I agree with you. I think ecumenism is proper. Now, I will say that there are certain doctrinal disputes that I think do matter. Like, I mean, honestly, obviously, I wouldn't welcome a Mormon into fellowship, like, or Jehovah's Witnesses, like.
But would those disputes matter if there was only one church and it had the final say in everything? One denomination, I should say.
Oh, well,
Fortunately, we have others
uh,
to balance us out.
yeah, I agree. I
I,
agree. Like,
I say this often, that when you come to church, everybody's got a Bible in their lap.
yeah,
And when the pastor opens their Bible, everybody should be opening their Bible, because
yes,
they're there to keep the pastor accountable.
that's true.
They're reading along with the pastor.
Yeah,
And we've got a
exactly.
system that is self-correcting. None of us are God. None of us are Christ. None of us have the final say. We are the
Exactly.
church of Christ, and Christ is
I
our head.
agree. I agree with that. Like, I think like it's sad when I see churches where people just go there and they don't open their Bible when the pastor's preaching. And they're just like take whatever the pastor says as if it's gospel truth. I don't like that. Like, I think,
Yeah.
like you said, we should
Puts them in a position where they, if the pastor's wrong, everybody's wrong. Sadly.
exactly. Yes. So my next question is, what are your thoughts on Christian counseling versus secular counseling?
All right, I will answer this, but I'd like to wrap things up at this point because it's 4:00 and
Oh yeah,
4:30.
yeah, yeah.
And yeah, so all right, so secular counseling versus Christian counseling.
Yeah.
That's a difficult call for me to make because I've never been involved in Christian counseling.
Okay.
All of the institutions that I've worked in have been essentially secular.
Yeah.
And so I know what we do there. Now, I am now taking my PhD work in a Christian university, and I'm starting to get exposed to some of the philosophies behind Christian counseling and Christian psychology. And in fairness to Liberty gets a bad rep for several reasons, which are probably justified. But in their psychology program, they do the benefit of not preaching a specific philosophy of psychology. They introduce the realm and they say, look, you as a Christian are going to have to make a marriage between your faith and your psychology in some way. How are you going to do it? Here are your options. And one of the options is to keep the two separate, keep them under separate domains. So when I say they say you're going to have to marry it, I don't mean that they're telling you absolutely have to impinge your religion on your practice or vice versa. But they say that you're going to be living with both of these things. You need to come up with some kind of philosophy. Here are your options. And Christian psychology is one of them. And as I've said, psychology involves both intervention and description. So one branch of psychology is trying to figure out how it is that we behave and what are the underlying causes of our behavior. And the other branch is trying to figure out how do we address behavior to improve it. And so Christian psychology can also be applied to both of those fields. Do we look at the Bible in order to describe and define behavior on the research end? And then do we look at the Bible on how to address behavior? I would say yes, we look at the Bible on how to address behavior. But that method of addressing behavior by bringing our Christian values into it has to look different if we're dealing with a Christian and if we're dealing with a non-Christian. If we're dealing with a Christian, we have some permission to actually, reference God and our beliefs in our practice. But as if we're dealing with a non-Christian, we can still use our values to guide our practice, but it may not be helpful to say, well, pray to get over it, kind of thing. Which I don't think a Christian counselor would say either.
Put a
little more thought into it than that.
Exactly. Well, I don't know, maybe some Christian counselors, but the most of them won't say that.
My fear in non-Christian counseling comes to the social issues, which are becoming sort of the visible issues in society now, dealing with sex and sexuality. Because the overall focus of, I'll put it this way, I am aware of an individual. I know an individual who went to prison for pedophilia, and he's out. Now, those kinds of sexual urges do not go away. It's not something you can counsel somebody out of. I've never heard of an instance of a person praying their way out of it. It's a instinct or impulse that you have, and it doesn't go away. Now, if you took this person to a Christian counselor, the Christian counselor would probably say something like, look, I understand that you're going to have these impulses for life, and you need to understand you're going to have these impulses for life. What you need to do is to not identify yourself by your impulses, but
Hmm.
rather by your identity in Christ. Don't
Yeah.
go out thinking of yourself as a person who has these impulses. Go out thinking of yourself as a child of God and
Hmm.
the bride of Christ, because where your identity is, that's where your focus will be. And
Wow.
so I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know if you, David, go around thinking about yourself as the guy who has schizophrenia, or if you think of
No.
yourself as the guy who does a podcast, the guy who's a theologian, the guy who is interested in philosophy. When I think about my identity, I typically identify myself either as an artist or as a father, because those are the things that are
Yeah.
important to me. And of course, because I identify myself by those, I tend to focus on my kids and on doing art.
Yeah.
Those are the things I enjoy. I like those things about me, and those are the things I focus on.
Yeah.
If I focused on my brain injuries, and if I thought of myself as the guy with TBI, then
Yeah.
I might be more focused on the emotional and mental conditions that come with that, and it might exacerbate that condition.
Hmm.
If, on the other hand, you were go to a secular therapist, the secular therapist would probably say something like, "Look, you have homosexual thoughts and feelings, and
Yeah.
you're exercising those on children. What you need to do is the healthy thing and exercise those with other adults that are consenting, and
Yeah.
stop letting your religious beliefs get in front of your sexuality. Express yourself sexually. Really ground yourself in that sexual identity,
Yeah.
and be the best homosexual you can be." So, I mean, that is a very contentious area, because anybody who is not um, firmly sold on Christianity as a field of thought would find it highly damaging to bring your religion
Yeah.
into any kind of therapy involving sexuality, because
Yeah.
there's this sort of stigma around conversion therapy where, I mean, it's alleged that they were physically or mentally abusing people, and
Yeah. I
um,
know.
that it never works or anything like that. And so it's just a no to even talk about it.
Hmm.
But what does my friend, who is both a Christian and also um, have those impulses, do?
Yeah, that's true. Look,
Because he's
when it
court
comes to,
mandated to see a counselor. He's got to see somebody.
yeah, yeah. When it comes to like conversion therapy, like I don't know exactly where I stand. I know it is contentious, and like I was recently asked that question recently: is what's my stance on conversion therapy? And I don't know enough about that to make a definitive answer to that, because I don't know about conversion therapy. I've heard all the arguments against it, like that it doesn't work and that it's abusive and stuff like that, and I haven't really heard any arguments for it. So I mean, I kind of, I don't want to say that I'm against it, but I don't want to say that I'm for it either. Like, but
I sit in basically the same camp, because
really,
it's not a thing I have looked into extensively.
yeah,
And
exactly.
my instinct is to say that it probably has been harmful,
Hmm.
because that is the largest. I've never heard any success stories from it.
Yeah,
Um, and I've never heard anything particularly positive about it. Everything I've heard is negative. But on the other hand, if anything positive had come out of it, would I have heard of it? That's the
yeah.
question. I
Well, I
mean, would
know.
that have showed up?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like speaking about like okay, so you mentioned your friend that like I too have a friend who was in jail because of pedophilia, and he became a Christian while he was in jail. And I asked him recently, and it was quite interesting. I didn't ask him this recently. I asked him a while back. I said, "Hey, if do you ever fear that you might fall back into that sin again?" I forgot exactly how I worded it, but his answer was kind of telling to me. He said no, because he loves Jesus and that he believes that God has changed him.
Hmm.
Like, what are your thoughts about that?
I can't comment on it. I don't know the guy. I don't know the circumstances.
Yeah, true. Good point. Like, I just thought that was interesting the way he said that, and I was just like, Well, because I remember, because I was just saying that because you said that someone who's a pedophile will always struggle with those urges, and I just it just got me thinking about my friend, about how it just made me wonder. So does he still struggle with those urges, or and he's just realizes that since he's living for Christ that he can't fulfill it, he can't follow those urges, or it just raises a lot of questions based on what you said.
All right. Well, let me put it this way.
Like,
do you feel that if you were trying and praying harder and being more spiritual, that your schizophrenia would go away?
no.
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 I believe that pedophilia is a mental condition.
Yeah.
And in the case of the person I know, it was gotten because he was sexually abused as a child, and so he's acting out. And I mentioned this to you before, that when you're sexually abused, it triggers hormones in your system, and the abuse itself becomes sexualized, and so that's where your sexual impulses go.
Mm-hmm.
And so, people have sexual impulses. It's who we are as creatures, individuals, organisms. I could expand that to say organisms have sexual impulses, because that's just nature. And they don't go away. And human beings are the only organisms that are as messy with our sexual impulses as we are.
Yeah.
They are all over the map.
That's interesting that you said that you believe pedophilia is a mental disorder. So do you also do you distinguish between it being a mental disorder and do you say it's a mental disorder and sinful, or do you just say it's a mental disorder, or do you say it's just sinful?
Well, if you abuse a child, it's sinful, regardless of what led you to abuse that child.
Yeah.
So whatever underlying conditions led to the act of abuse, the act of abuse itself is a sin.
Okay, that makes sense. No, I just asked that question because I know a lot of Christians, when they hear you say that pedophilia is a mental disorder, in their mind they think, oh, he's trying to excuse pedophilia by calling it a mental disorder instead of calling it sin. But what I hear you saying is that it's a mental disorder that can lead to sin.
As temptations do.
Yeah, that makes
I defy a person in your audience to say that they've never had sexual temptation of any kind.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think anybody would say that they don't have a sexual temptation.
I think that possibly being abused as a child moves that behavior from a thought to an action.
Yeah.
Because you've had that action acted out upon you. And so you are mimicking behavior that you've already experienced.
Yeah.
And I can say that as a person who's worked with sexually abused children, because they were all very extremely sexualized.
Yeah.
They would behave in sexualized ways toward each other and adults, and they were mimicking the behaviors that had been done to them.
Yeah. All right.
And sometimes that continues into adulthood.
Yeah. All right. So I just have one more thing I just want to say. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they contact you?
Well, probably the best thing to do would be to go to my website, joelfurches.com. My name's on the screen, so just my name and .com. There's a contact form there, and you can see some of the research that I do, as well as things I've written and my art, if you're interested. And I have a Twitter at Joel Furches, the J and the F capitalized. Most of my research, my actual research, is shared on my my feeds, Switching Sides. So Switching Sides, there's a Facebook page for Switching Sides. There's a YouTube channel for Switching Sides, and I have a Twitter handle at Sides Switching.
All right, cool. And I'll post your website in the description box so people can, when they watch the playback of this, they can see it. Did you have any questions for me, by the way?
I did. Oh yeah, I was interested in finding out what the Buddhist approach to schizoaffective disorder was, what their philosophy or approach would be.
That's actually a good question. Like, I know, like, in Buddhism, they believe that everything is just an illusion. Like,
Mm-hmm.
they believe that everything is an illusion, and that the the ultimate goal is to essentially cease to exist. That's essentially what
Mm-hmm.
nirvana is cease to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to achieve that, you have to give up all desire, which ironically the wanting to give up all desire is a desire in of itself. But like but that's so what a Buddhist would say about schizophrenia, I don't know, honestly. I mean, because they already operate on the assumption that everything is an illusion to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So, if from that worldview, if everything is an illusion, then that would mean schizophrenia is even an illusion too. Like,
Well, that's interesting because illusion has to exist within a mind. There has to
yeah,
be a mind to be having the illusion
yeah, that's
that is
true.
impressed upon. And so, if schizophrenia is also grounded in a mind, then
Who's
schizophrenia
mine?
is a kind of illusion that doesn't solve what to do with it.
Yeah, yeah, like that. I don't know how a Buddhist will handle like
Okay,
schizophrenia.
I didn't know if your mother had, being raised in that sort of environment, if your disability had been addressed under those standards or not.
Oh,
I suppose not.
my mother, she never acknowledged that she had a mental illness. Like she didn't. She thought she was quick to point out that I was quote unquote crazy, but like she couldn't see it in herself.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Like,
mean that might be, that might actually be categorized by Buddhism. If it's removal of desire and a denial of self, then I could see how you
yeah,
might deny conditions that you might have. But
yeah,
that's a theory that doesn't, you know. It was interesting to me that there might have been some intersection in your life between Buddhism and your mental condition.
yeah. Like, it definitely is interesting. Like, I, I was never a Buddhist myself. Like,
Sure.
I remember when I was a kid, like my mom taking me to Buddhist temple and we were doing ancestral rites and stuff like that. But I like when I got into foster care, like I was in a foster home with Christian parents, and
Okay.
like then my sisters were raised Christian, and like so I from the time I was like 13 to like maybe like well from 13 to 16 I was in a Christian household, and
Mm-hmm.
then from 16 to 19 I was kind of anti-Christian, and then
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so yeah, but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I get that.
exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming on here. Like, I appreciate it. Like, I know, like, it takes a lot of courage to come on here and talk about this stuff. So I do thank you for coming on here. You had fun, right?
Yeah, I had fun. Hope you did too.
Yeah, I did too. I enjoy these conversations. I could talk about this all day long, but I know you probably have other things to do, and like, so I won't take up your time. I mean, we're friends on Facebook, so if I ever want to talk to you, I can like message you. But
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, again, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the viewers for watching this stream. I know this kind of got really long, and so I thank people for watching this whole thing, and I thank everyone for watching that's going to watch the playback to this too. I do want to let people know that if they do decide to support this ministry via Patreon, it'll give them access to a private Discord community for online peer support and fellowship. It'll also give them access to a devotional on faith and mental illness. I'm actually working on getting my devotional published. I'm trying to get it published by July 1st. So, and then also, me and my ministry team are making ourselves available for 24-hour peer support. We're not mental health professionals, but we are making ourselves available for peer support. So they can contact me like at 567-343-3727. Or they can email me at christcentermentalhealth@gmail.com, or they can email one of my team members. Their emails are in the description box below. We are currently looking for a Christian counselor to join our team. So if you are interested, or you know someone who's a Christian counselor that'd be interested in joining, you can send them my way. Like we are looking for a Christian counselor. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Like, again, thank you for coming on here. Like, but, yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And like, let me know what your friend, your Nick Peters, you said his name was?
Yep.
Let me know what he says about coming on here for an interview. I would like to have him.
You're probably going to need to send me a message reminding me of the links I need to send and the things that I said I would do for you.
Okay.
Because again, memory's not my strength.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to rewatch this again because I kind of forgot about the links, but I remember Nick Peters.
Yep.
Like, so I got that name. Like, I'm gonna remember that. But the links that we said that I asked you to send me, I'm gonna have to rewatch this to remember. Like, my memory is probably just as good as your memory.
All right.
All right. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
All right, bye.